Welcome to Chapter 12. In this section, I will be talking about how we regulate our body temperature. As humans, we need to regulate our body temperature so it remains nearly constant at 37 degrees Celsius. So when our body temperature becomes hotter than this, our thermoregulatory function is going to be able to cool us down. Likewise, if our body temperature dips below 37 degrees Celsius, our body will help to try and increase the amount of heat being produced in our body to increase our body temperature. So fluctuations in our body temperature should not be greater than 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. There are exceptions to this, and this is in times of fever or extreme conditions where our body temperature will fluctuate um, a greater range than normal. So for example, if we're sick and we have a fever, the new set point of our internal body temperature would be increased from 37 degrees Celsius to say 37.5 degrees Celsius. And this would allow our body to stay at a new homeostasis, allowing increased immune responses to work at this higher temperature in our body. The only way as humans we dissipate heat is to move heat from the core to our skin. And the way we do this is going to be through four different mechanisms. So the first two are conduction and convection. Conduction is the actual molecular contact of you with an object to transfer heat. So for example, if you wrap your hands around a warm mug on a cold day, you are gaining heat from that mug through conduction. Or if you go to the beach and you submerge yourself underwater to cool, the water that is in contact with your skin is cooler than your body temperature, resulting in heat dissipation from the body. Convection is similar, but this talks about the motion of the gas or liquid across that surface. So for example, if you are hot, you might stand in front of a fan and there would be a convective heat dissipation from your skin through the movement of air moving across your skin. Radiation is defined as the heat that's given off or accepted as infrared rays. So to gain heat through radiation, this comes from the sun. So this is why if you're running outside on a sunny day with little cloud coverage, you should be dressed in light colored clothing and not dark colored clothing, which would minimize the amount of heat gain through the sun. We also can gain heat through radiation that bounces off asphalt or the ground and reflects it back onto us. So if you have a option of running over grass or over asphalt on a sunny day, you would probably be better off running over grass because you would gain less heat through radiation. Also, if you've noticed, if you've ever gone to the Korean fair down in Kaka'ako that's held in that ward area, that area is surrounded by a lot of buildings with mirrored exterior walls. And when you get to a certain point, the ambient temperature is a lot hotter than where you had parked originally. And the reason being is that the sun is bouncing off its radiation off those mirrored exterior walls and it's causing you to gain additional heat through radiation. Evaporation is a primary avenue for heat dissipation during exercise. And unlike the other modes of heat transfer, evaporation only goes one way, where evaporation only helps us to lose heat. We cannot gain heat through evaporation. So basically what evaporation is sweat, and then as the sweat evaporates or dries from our skin, it provides a cooling mechanism. And this is our primary way of heat dissipation during exercise. So evaporation accounts for 80% of total heat loss during exercise. So this is why on very, very humid days and you're exercising outside, the exercise itself seems relatively harder than if you were to exercise in an air-conditioned gym. Because instead of the evaporation happening where the sweat would be evaporated from the skin and the sweat may be rolling off your skin, this means that evaporation is not occurring. The evaporation of the sweat off the skin is not occurring, and this is our main way to dissipate heat during exercise. So at rest, radiation and convection are our primary methods for heat dissipation, and during exercise, evaporation is our main avenue for heat dissipation. And again, evaporation only goes in one way, where it helps to remove heat, whereas radiation, conduction, and convection work in both directions, where it can remove heat and then add heat to the body. So we have sensory thermal receptors in the skin, and the CNS then is going to be able to detect changes in the temperature, and this happens at our hypothalamus. So specifically, the preoptic anterior hypothalamus and the cerebral cortex will receive this afferent signal or sensory information. So the skin temperature changes occur before core temp, and this means that this allows for behavioral changes to happen before physiological changes. So for example, if you walk outside from an air-conditioned room out into a very hot and humid day, your skin temperature will sense the heat. So your behavioral adaptation would be to remove your jacket first. And this happens before the onset of sweating, which would be your physiological response to heat gain. So the cerebral cortex, I'm looking at this last bullet point, allows for the conscious perception of temperature and then a voluntary control of how you will adapt to increasing heat load or a cold environment. So what happens when we become hot? Well, the preoptic anterior hypothalamus will send a signal through the sympathetic nervous system to the smooth muscles in the walls of the arterioles to cause vasodilation. So if we look at number one, increased temperature is going to happen, and this is going to send a signal to our preoptic anterior hypothalamus, which will then cause our skin arterioles to vasodilate. And this is going to help move our blood from the core to our skin to help dissipate heat across our skin. Also, we might begin to sweat, and it's shown in number 4, where our sweat glands become active, and hopefully our sweat would be able to evaporate off our skin, and this would help us to cool even more. On the other hand, in times of cold, when our body temperature drops below our set point of 37 degrees Celsius, this signal also goes to our preoptic anterior hypothalamus, and this causes vasoconstriction. So the hypothalamus would signal to cause vasoconstriction in our arterioles to shunt blood from the skin, to try and keep the blood within our core so we won't lose unnecessary heat through our periphery. And we see this when we enter environments of cold, where our hands and feet are very white, which shows us that we don't have a lot of blood flow happening. And so the anastomosis in our hands and our feet of our glabrous skin or non-hairy skin, so the soles of your feet and the palms of your hand, they have these anastomosis that allow for very precise control and very effective control of blood flow. And that's why if you look at your hands in different environmental conditions, it can go from being white to very bright flush red, and that's because the arterioles are controlling where the blood is going to be redirected to. So in times of cold, we're going to shunt blood away from our skin, keep that blood within our core, and our hands will become white and it'll look white in appearance. If that is not enough to keep our body heat within our core, our metabolism will increase, and this is regulated by T4 or thyroxine, and also T3 as well, triiodothyronine. And the epinephrine and norepinephrine hormones will also enhance metabolic rate. Another way we increase body temperature is through shivering, which is shown in number 4. So shivering is a way that we increase our heat generation. It increases our metabolism, and it's an involuntary cycle of contraction and relaxation of muscle. And shivering is a complete waste of energy. And shivering only uses glucose as its primary fuel source. So if you are taking athletes out to compete, or if you're going to go out to compete in a cold environment, you want to make sure that when you're competing or when you're preparing to compete, that shivering is not taking place, because 1, it's going to deplete your glycogen, and 2, it's going to divert energy away from your activity itself. So we know that cardiovascular drift is when heart rate starts to creep up over a long endurance event due to dehydration. And it can be due to the fact that we're very hot and blood is being redirected to our skin. And as a result, venous return drops, causing a reduction in stroke volume, which results in this increase in heart rate or cardiovascular drift. There's another theory out there called the hot brain, which states that regardless at the rate at which our core temperature increases, the brain will signal to stop exercise when a critical brain temperature is reached. So there's different theories of what is regulating fatigue due to, or exercise termination due to heat gain. So we have 2 different types of sweat glands, one being eccrine sweat glands and the other one being apocrine, which is our nervous perspiration sweat gland. Eccrine sweat glands are the sweat glands that are responsible for secreting sweat to allow us to evaporate and cool. Apocrine glands do not contribute a lot to heat loss through evaporation. So in these eccrine sweat glands, we have a coil here that you see is being stimulated or controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. And then you also see that there's a duct before the sweat reaches the surface of the skin. So the sweat formed in the secretory part of the sweat gland has the same electrolyte composition as blood. So you can imagine if we were to sweat a lot, we would be losing a lot of electrolytes in the same composition as it exists in blood. But one of the benefits of heat acclimation or heat acclimatization is that we're able to sweat more dilute sweat. So as the sweat is sweated out through the duct, absorption of sodium and chloride is going to be able to happen through this duct portion. So also realize that the sweat rate, the rate at which the sweat is leaving through the duct, is going to dictate or regulate how much can be reabsorbed, how much sodium can be reabsorbed, because the faster the sweat rate, the less time that the duct has to absorb the sodium. So this sweat gland is going to be regulated by the sympathetic nerve. So you can see how the sweat gland is connected to efferent signaling from the CNS. Because if the CNS is signaling sympathetic nervous system stimulation, it will stimulate sweat gland activity. So we can increase our sweat by increasing our onset of sweating, so we can start sweating sooner. We can increase the number of sweat glands activated and increase the amount of sweat produced by each sweat gland. So maximal recruitment can be achieved in little as 8 minutes. The more heat acclimated you are, the earlier onset of sweating occurs, and the more dilute sweat you will also sweat. So I put this slide up here because I wanted to point out that our sweat rate can exceed the rate that we're able to absorb fluids that we ingest to replenish or to hydrate. So our sweat rate, depending on who we are and how acclimated we are to heat, can range from 0.8 all the way up to greater than 3 liters per hour. The maximum rate of stomach emptying is 0.8 to 1.2 liters per hour. So you can see that depending on the activity that we're doing, we would not possibly be able to replenish the fluids at the rate that we're losing them, which makes it easy for athletes in endurance events exercising in the heat to become dehydrated easily, especially if the subject or the athlete is hydrating with a sport drink with higher osmolality. Remember, we said that a sport drink should not have more than 6% carbohydrates contained within it. So if they're ingesting something with carbohydrates to replenish their glucose, this will also slow the rate of stomach emptying, so they would be at a higher risk of not hydrating fully. I also want to point out that our hormones, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, and aldosterone, are helping us through this process. So vasopressin, or ADH, remember, it's released from the posterior pituitary gland, and it contributes to water conservation at the kidneys. Aldosterone, remember, its main function was to reabsorb sodium at the kidneys. Aldosterone also acts on our sweat glands. So aldosterone will help to reabsorb sodium at the sweat gland. So aldosterone acts both at the kidney and at our eccrine sweat glands, which is pretty cool. So I want to reiterate the difference between dehydration and hypohydration. Dehydration means that you went out and you exercised and you sweat a lot. So you sweat a lot of water out, and you also rehydrated with water, but maybe not sodium. So dehydration is when plasma osmolality increase. Hypohydration is when we lose total body fluid, or we lose water, but we lose it, but its loss does not affect our plasma osmolality. So I used this example before. So dehydration is like taking a pot of water with salt, put salt in it, and letting that water boil. As it boils, water is evaporating out, but the amount of sodium remains the same in the pot. But since we've lost water, we have a relative increase in osmolality. Hypohydration is if we take that same pot of salted water and we ladle out, so we remove a homogeneous amount of water that contains the same amount of sodium. This means that our blood volume has reduced, but the amount of salt or osmolality in that pot of water has not changed. So be sure to know the difference between dehydration and hypohydration, where dehydration happens with exercise and hypohydration happens when we have fluid body shifts, so bed rest, when our venous return increases and our atria detects an increased pressure, which causes it to release ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide, which which then stimulates diuresis. So this process happens when we undergo bed rest when we're sick, and also astronauts in microgravity um, are affected by this. Hydromyesis is sweat gland fatigue, and it's when we have sweat for a long time, for greater than 2 hours, and basically the epidermal cells around the sweat glands become swollen and they cause the pores to close, and so therefore we stop sweating. Anhidrosis is a complete inability to sweat. So if you're working with a patient or client who has anhidrosis and you realize that evaporation is a main avenue of heat dissipation during exercise, you will probably come to the conclusion that you must exercise indoors where it's cool, where your client would not have a great amount of heat body storage. So this figure is from your book, and it shows that in untrained men and women, their sweat composition of sodium chloride is higher. So with acclimation or with training, they sweat more dilute sweat. So in trained men, their sodium chloride concentration is about 1/3 to 1/2 compared to untrained men. For trained women, they conserve about 1/2 or 50% of the sodium when compared to untrained women. So this is how we become better sweaters, where we're able to sweat more dilute sweat. So notice that potassium, calcium, and magnesium are not reabsorbed by the sweat glands, and therefore the sweat composition is going to be similar between plasma and sweat. So how do we check for signs of dehydration? One, we can measure urine output. I think the general rule is you must go to the restroom at a minimum 4 to 5 times a day. If your urine output is less than 1 liter per day, that's a sure sign of dehydration. Specific gravity is when we would take a urine sample and use a transfer pipette and put it on this refractometer. So you would put the urine sample on this side, and there's this plastic cover slip that you would lift up and then put the urine sample on and then close that cover slip very gently so that urine doesn't splash. And then you would look into this eyepiece and hold it up to light. And when you do that, what you would see is a scale. And wherever this line appears, so it appears a colored and then a clear line, and this looks like it would be 1.0 between 0.3 and 0.4. So I'm looking between 0.3 and 0.4. So anything that is greater than a specific gravity of 1.03 would be deemed dehydrated. So if you see this line here, it says 30. So if it looks like this sample would state that this individual is dehydrated. So if you see this number 30, anything greater or above this would signal dehydration. Anything a line lower than here would indicate that the individual is hydrated. There's also a urine color chart that is easy to use. You would have to transfer the urine sample into a clear test tube, hold it up to light, and then compare it to the urine color chart. Anything greater than a color of 6 would be deemed as dehydrated. The ACSM statement or guidelines state that an athlete should drink 500 mLs of fluid 2 hours prior to exercise. You want to drink during exercise, drink early, and then drink to maintain your body weight. Remember, a 2% loss of body weight due to dehydration will impair your performance and endurance activity. You want to make sure the fluid is cool because it's going to be more palatable. Water is the best choice with a few options, with the exception being exercise lasting longer than 1 hour. In that case, you would probably want to replenish with um, sodium and carbohydrates. And this is where your Gatorade and your sports drinks come into play. The heat index has been traditionally been used to determine the environmental conditions for athletes. The heat index takes into account air temperature and relative humidity. A better way to determine environmental conditions is something called WBGT, which stands for wet bulb globe temperature, because it accounts for conduction, convection, evaporation, and radiation. So how do we do this? The wet bulb globe temperature is comprised of 3 different temperatures. One being a dry bulb temperature, which would be if you had a thermometer and you held it at the event location, whatever that thermometer read would be your dry bulb. Your wet bulb would be a measure of humidity, the evaporative capacity in that environment. And the way you would determine this is using something called a sling psychrometer. This is a sling psychrometer down here. And what it is a thermometer with some sort of gauze that we can wet at the end. And it's held on a handle which can be spun around. So you would wet the gauze with deionized water, hold the handle, and sling it around and swing it around until this temperature on the thermometer stops dropping. The more dry the condition, the temperature would drop more. The more humid the condition, the temperature would change to a smaller degree. And this is important because this is measuring our evaporative capacity, right? So if it's very humid, our ability to rely on evaporation as a body cooling mechanism is going to be limited. And that is why this temperature is rated at 70% of the entire equation. Your globe temperature takes into account radiation. So radiation from the sun. So if you're performing exercise in the gym or indoors, your globe temperature and your dry bulb temperature would be the same. If you're exercising or performing out under in the daytime, your globe temperature would be the temperature that would be taken from a metal sphere with the thermometer stuck in the middle, and this sphere should be painted with a flat black paint. And this will measure the radiation that is being gained from the sun. So you guys know what I'm talking about. In the summertime, when you park out in the sun because you can't find parking in the shade, and then you get to your car and your thermometer in the car tells you it's like 95 degrees Fahrenheit. But the environmental condition for that day was reported on the news to be 82 degrees Fahrenheit. And that difference between 82 and 95 is due to the radiation from the sun. So the globe temperature, which is abbreviated with the T sub G, takes into account radiation. So according to this equation, this factor, the wet bulb temperature, or the temperature that reflects our evaporative cooling capacity, is the most heavily weighted. And then the next heavily weighted factor is the globe temperature, meaning radiation from the sun is going to highly impact our body heat gain and our ability to dissipate heat. So when we look back at the heat index, it doesn't take into account radiation, right? It only takes into account humidity and dry bulb temperature, or what are the ambient temperatures that day. So when you're planning an event, you want to take into account the WBGT, the wet bulb globe temperature, and realize that high humidity is going to limit the ability of the athletes to dissipate heat, and this is going to increase the risk of heat illness. Also, if you're exercising or competing on a very humid day with no clouds in sight and with no air velocity or movement of air or trade winds, this is going to drastically negatively affect your athlete's ability to dissipate heat and really increasing the risk of heat illness. So these are just guidelines for preventing hyperthermia. Basically, cancel events if the environmental load, heat load is going to be too much. Because remember, as athletes exercise, they're going to be generating metabolic heat as well. So they're going to be gaining heat from the environment, the sun. They're going to be generating heat from their exercising muscles. And if their evaporative cooling mechanism is going to be limited by the humidity, this is going to increase the risk of heat illness. So this brings us to the end of this section, and I will record the next section on heat illness. In this section, we're going to discuss acclimation or acclimatization to altitude. Remember, acclimation refers to the adaptations that are obtained in artificial conditions. Acclimatization refers to the adaptations that are attained in natural conditions. So acclimation and acclimatization results in pulmonary, cardiovascular, and skeletal muscle changes that improves performance. And this takes about 3 weeks at moderate altitude. So any increase in altitude above moderate altitude, you would have to add another additional week for every 600 meter of ascent that you are performing at. So the pulmonary adaptations that we see, of course, we have an increased ventilation at rest and during some maximal exercise. This is what we talked about in the previous section. Your resting ventilation rate is 40% higher than at sea level, and the submaximal rate is 50 times higher. Your erythropoietin levels will also increase as a result of the hypoxic conditions. So the erythropoietin release from the kidney will increase red blood cell production over the next few days, but it takes about 18 to 23 days to see measurable changes in hematocrit. And this is because the half-life of the red blood cell is about 28 days. So the increase in erythropoietin stimulates polycythemia, which is the increase in red blood cell count. And your red blood cell count will remain elevated for 3 months post-altitude exposure, even after return to sea level. So polycythemia is defined as a hematocrit greater than 60%. At sea level, normal hematocrit levels are about 45% to 50%. So a hematocrit level of 60% is a significant improvement or significant increase in hematocrit. Although our oxygen carrying capacity has increased, we also need to remember that an increase in red blood cell count or polycythemia increases the viscosity of the blood flow, or increases the viscosity of the blood and decreases blood flow. Our plasma volume, as we discussed earlier, drops off as soon as we ascend to altitude. Over time, plasma volume slowly increases, and then this plasma volume increase supports an increased stroke volume and cardiac output. But remember that first initial drop in plasma volume is due to the release of ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, and also the insensible water loss through our respiratory tract due to hyperventilation in a dry climate. So there's a study that was performed that showed the effect of intermittent hypoxic conditioning on arterial oxygen saturation. So this was done on 9 males and 4 females, and O2 sat is measured with a pulse oximeter, and at sea level it is about 97 or 98%, and that is normal at sea level. So what this is showing is at different altitudes ranging from 2,700 meters to 6,400 meters, And these are simulated altitudes, which mean that the level of oxygen was reduced to match what would be available at these altitudes. So what this table is showing is that at these different altitudes, there is an apparent decrease in oxygen saturation, whereas normal O2 sat is 97 to 98%. So you can see as we move to altitude, O2 saturation drops. As we move down the table across the weeks, it looks like oxygen saturation starts to increase, right? 82 to 86 to 90, and so on and so forth. And this is due to the acclimation of the body to intermittent hypoxia, meaning the body is responding to these hypoxic conditions by increasing red blood cell production through erythropoietin, which is increasing our oxygen carrying capacity. So athletes and coaches have been playing with living high, living low, training high, living low, different combinations of this to try and maximize the amount of erythropoietin and red blood cell production. So one of the best ways to improve performance is to have your athlete train low and sleep high. So this means that they would be able to train low at sea level, perform their maximal exertion, do their training at maximal intensity, and then at night sleep in a chamber with reduced oxygen content. So the reduced oxygen content would stimulate erythropoietin release, increase red blood cell count when they sleep. So instead of breathing 21% O2 at night, they would breathe 15% of oxygen at night, and this would and this hypoxic condition would stimulate erythropoietin. So this graph is showing the hemoglobin concentration of individuals who live at sea level versus altitude. And it shows that at altitude, hemoglobin levels of individuals who reside at altitude are the highest. And as altitude comes back down to sea level, hemoglobin concentrations are reduced. Remember, normal hemoglobin concentrations are about 14 to 15 grams per deciliter. So as we move and we start to reside at altitude, the body compensates and adapts by increasing the hemoglobin concentration. And this is related to erythropoietin. At altitude, we also have a decrease in muscle function and a decrease in cross-sectional area of the muscle. The main reason being we have a negative protein balance. One, we might be sick, we might have acute mountain sickness, so we're going to be dehydrated. Our caloric intake will be reduced, but we also have an increased basal metabolic rate. So as a result, we will lose muscle mass. However, we increase our capillary density as a result of the hypoxic conditions. So remember we said that the body will adapt only when it's stressed beyond a certain point. Under hypoxic conditions, the body tries to adapt by developing new capillary beds, and according to Fick's law of diffusion, the greater the surface area, the greater the diffusion of that gas across the membrane. So the increased capillary density will help to increase the amount of gas diffusion across the membrane, specifically into the tissue. Our muscle metabolic function reduces, our mitochondrial function and glycolytic enzymes reduce, as well as our oxidative capacity. So there was a study that used runners that show there are no major cardiovascular adaptations after 2 months of altitude. Although they would be more tolerant to the hypoxic conditions, and they would have had the increased red blood cell count, the increased hematocrit and hemoglobin, there are no positive benefits on the heart itself. And this is probably due to the fact that at altitude, you're not able to train at the same intensity as you are at sea level. So the investigators did not find improvements in the left ventricular internal diameter, the left ventricular wall thickness, and so on. So many competitors and coaches try to find that combination of training, or try to find that training regimen that would give their athletes that extra edge. So there's a combination of things that have been tried to train high and then compete low, train high to gain those benefits and adaptations to altitude, and then compete high, and then train low and then compete high. So different variations have been studied. What we do know is that 3 weeks of acclimation or acclimatization are needed to receive the full adaptations. And this is at moderate altitude, so 2,000 to 3,000 meters. For each 600-meter ascent, another week of acclimation is required. And all of these effects are lost within a month of return to sea level. Sorry, I hope we can't hear the noise. Somebody's doing construction. Okay, so at altitude, there is hypoxia, hypoxic conditions, and this prevents high intensity aerobic training. So when you train at altitude, your ability to perform at the highest maximal capacity is hindered, and this will have a detraining effect on your athletes. Also, living and training high is going to lead to dehydration, a low blood volume, a low venous return, a low stroke volume, and that negative nitrogen balance will also lead to low muscle mass or a loss of muscle mass. So many have asked, what is the value of living high but training low? So the training low portion allows the athlete to train at maximal intensity. So if you were to ask an exercise physiologist, what would be the timeline for competing at altitude? Should I take my team up right before the event, or should I take them up 2 to 3 weeks prior and let them acclimatize? Most will say to compete as soon as possible after arriving at altitude. Although you do not confer the benefits of acclimatization, the likelihood of your athlete succumbing to acute mountain sickness will be small. The most severe symptoms of acute mountain sickness occur at 2 to 3 days post altitude exposure. So you want to compete as soon as possible after arriving at altitude so that your athletes do not succumb to acute mountain sickness. Acute mountain sickness is one of the illnesses of altitude, and we'll talk about this in the next section. Training high for 2 weeks before competing will allow the athlete to overcome the most severe symptoms of acute mountain sickness. But again, they're going to have to be working their way up from possibly, most likely, being dehydrated from being sick, working back up from a negative nitrogen or protein balance because of the reduced drive to consume food, the increased basal metabolic rate, and they need to try and build their plasma volume back up to the same level it was at sea level. So aerobic training at altitude is not going to be as effective because the subject will not be able to push themselves to the same extent at altitude versus sea level. So if you train high and live low, you'll get the best of both worlds, meaning you can train at sea level at maximal exertion, but at night, maybe sleep in an artificial chamber that provides hypoxic conditions. So you would reap the benefits of low oxygen partial pressures in the air. There was a study that tested athletes on a 5K run, and they showed that living high and training low had significant improvements on their 5K run time trial. So living high and training low has been validated, where athletes would live at 2,500 meters and then train at a lower altitude. Their aerobic performance improved by 1% and their VO2 max improved by 3%. And when you're in the elite athlete status, this 1 to 3% improvement is huge, and it's a significant improvement in endurance performance. So this graph is showing the effects of living high and training low on aerobic performance. And the way to read this is any dot or any data point above this blue line indicates an improvement in race time. So for example, in this individual, he had a 4% improvement in race time. Anything below this blue line indicates a decrement in performance time. So for example, for this data point, this indicates that this female collegiate athlete had a 2% decrement in race time. So on the whole, it suggests that most athletes will benefit from living high and training low, and there'll be a handful of athletes who will have the opposite response. So it's this living high and training low will be specific to your athlete and would need to be determined based upon how they respond to this type of training regimen. So artificial altitude training is effective in the sense that if you breathe hypoxic air 1 to 2 hours a day and train um, normally, that previous study that I showed that the oxygen saturation improved. However, there's contradicting or controversy around this concept, where artificial altitude training in some studies have shown no improvements in exercise performance. So a lot of it has to do on the responsiveness of the athlete to this type of training. So just remember that training high will stimulate the altitude acclimation. So you'd reap the benefits, but training high also does not allow your athlete to train as hard. So you'll lose some of the physical conditioning. Sleeping high and training low has not scientifically been validated yet, but as you can see based upon the data that we showed earlier, that the majority of endurance athletes would benefit from this type of training regimen. So living high in a natural condition and training low, some people believe is the best approach, especially for elite athletes. Non-elite athletes may benefit from artificial approaches. Again, it just will depend on your athlete's response to this training regimen. So this is the end of this section. In the previous sections, we talked about how we can assess body composition. In this section, we're going to talk about what are the normative percentage of body fat ranges and the impact of body fat on performance. So this table is taken from your textbook where it gives different percentages of body fat for males and females in different sports. So the lower cusp of percentage of body fat are reported for females in bodybuilding at 6%, in gymnastics at 8%, triathlon and rowing also at 8%. The lower cusp for males is 5%, and that's reported with bodybuilding, football, which is surprising, at 5 to 25%, skating, wrestling, and weightlifting also at 5%. So notice that these are normative ranges that are being reported for each sport. If you were to use these different body composition methods in the field, you'll also have to realize that each measurement that you derive or measure is going to have a plus and minus 1 to 2% body fat. So keep this in mind as you use these body composition methods in the field. So most athletes are focused on maximizing fat-free mass. So this is the skeletal muscle mass, which is going to be desirable for strength, power, and muscular endurance, and to minimize their relative body fat, which many coaches believe improves speed, endurance, balance, agility, and jumping ability. So this line of thought is taken from previous research that show that the lower the percentage of body fat of the athlete, the faster they're able to run, the further they'll be able to jump, and the greater number of sit-ups that they would be able to perform compared to somebody with a higher percentage of body fat. However, in this field, we'd rather be concerned with total body size or weight versus fat-free mass or fat mass, because there may be some athletes that may not benefit from a higher fat-free mass, and these are going to be the athletes that need to carry their weight in their event. So, for example, long distance runners, they're usually lanky. High jumpers and long jumpers, pole jumpers and pole vaulters need to carry their weight. So, having a higher fat free mass is going to result in having um, greater mass to carry over these distances. Also, weightlifters and sumo wrestlers may benefit from being fatter. And then also, swimmers may benefit from having a little bit more fat since fat is buoyant, which will reduce the energy cost of staying on the surface. Yet, in general, when we're talking about athletic performance, the leaner the athlete, typically the better they perform. However, we'd like to point out that the percentage of body fat and performance data can be misleading in the sense that some coaches believe that if a small weight loss improves performance, then major weight loss should improve it even more. And this becomes very dangerous when working with athletes who perform in a sport where aesthetics is also considered. So this includes things such as gymnastics, dance, swimming, diving. And this can lead to injury, especially in female athletes who have a percentage of body fat that's less than 6%. Other risks involved with severe weight loss include dehydration, chronic fatigue related to overtraining, disordered eating and eating disorders, menstrual dysfunction, and bone mineral disorders. So dehydration and electrolyte imbalances is a major risk associated with severe weight loss. So fasting and low-calorie diets lead to a large amount of weight loss, and this occurs primarily through dehydration. So if you've ever noticed after you eat a high carbohydrate meal, such as pasta, the next day you feel very rigid, you feel heavy. And the reason for this is because for every gram of carbohydrate stored, 2.6 grams of water are also stored with it. So carbohydrates is a very heavy fuel. So by not eating a lot of carbohydrates, the amount of water stored with it is going to be reduced. Also, losses as little as 2% of body weight will impair performance. So say for instance, you weigh 150 pounds. If we multiply that by 2%, that results in a 3-pound weight loss. So for example, if you are dehydrated and you've lost 3 pounds due to water weight alone, this is classified as 2% of dehydration, or dehydration where your body weight has been reduced by 2%, and this would impair your performance, your sport performance. Severe weight loss also leads to chronic fatigue, and this is related to the neural and hormonal components, and it appears that the sympathetic nervous system is inhibited and the parasympathetic system dominates. So you're in a constant state of stress, and the hypothalamus doesn't function normally, and the immune function is impaired. So your ability to recover after cold or illness is going to be compromised. This is the female athlete triad, and it's comprised of 3 separate dysfunctions, which when they combine together, we call them the female athlete triad. And they're comprised of irregular periods or amenorrhea, low bone density or osteoporosis, and then some sort of eating disorder, whether it be bulimia or anorexia. So athletes with the female athlete triad are going to be very vulnerable to medical problems related to low energy availability, um, and also electrolyte imbalances. And since we know that sodium, potassium, and calcium are very important in our cardiac function, this is also going to be related to dysfunction of the cardiovascular system. So the female athlete triad is something that needs to be monitored for, especially in athletes who perform in a sport where aesthetics is part of the sport, such as gymnastics, ballet, dance. And again, they are categorized by these three different dysfunctions. And that is the end of this section. In this section, we'll be talking about DEXA, or dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. DEXA uses low energy X-ray to determine body composition, and it measures total body bone mass, lean tissue mass, and fat mass. And it's usually used to assess a region of the body, because to scan the entire body would take a very long time. So it has really good precision in estimating bone mass density and soft tissue. Primarily in the field, DEXA is used to measure bone mass density, particularly in individuals with high risk of osteoporosis who are osteopenic. So the DEXA measures bone-free lean tissue mass, fat mass, soft tissue mass, fat-free mass, and percentage of body fat. When working with subjects who are going to have the DEXA performed, they should be advised to not take any calcium supplements. Like any method, the machine needs to be calibrated against a known calibration marker. For the underwater weighing, we used a weight. For the BOD-POD, they used that 50-liter cylinder. And in this case, they would use different markers with known um, amounts of absorptiometry. So what you're going to see in this DEXA section is that there's an X-ray source, and the X-ray source sends out an X-ray through the body, and then the body would absorb some of the X-ray, and whatever is not absorbed would be detected by a detector array. So to calibrate this machine, you would use markers with known absorption rates to ensure that what the DEXA is measuring is actually real. This takes about 5 to 30 minutes, depending on how big the region that is being scanned, and also whether a fan-based or pencil-based method is used. So this looks like a fan-based method where there's a fan of X-ray, which is going to take less time than a pencil-based DEXA, where it just be a line or a pencil beam that is going to be sent through the individual. This is going to be a lot more accurate, but it's going to increase the amount of time that it takes. So the principle of DEXA is that the density of tissue attenuates X-rays of high and low photon energies at different rates. So in other words, the denser the body part, there's going to be more absorption, and then less detection is going to be detected by the array detector at the top. DEXA also has a lot of assumptions, one being that the amount of fat over bone is going to be the same as the amount of fat over bone-free tissue. Also, it has the assumption that the anterior posterior depth of the person's limb or body part that is going to be measured is no more than 20 centimeters. So if you're using the DEXA on the abdominal region, you need to make sure that the patient's anterior posterior depth is no more than 20 centimeters or 7.8 inches. The hydration and electrolyte content of the lean body mass is constant. This is another assumption of the DEXA. So limitations to the DEXA, obviously for obese clients, you would only be able to do regional body comp methods over perhaps the arms or legs and not the trunk region. Children also have more water than bone in the fat-free mass compartment, or and also the elderly have differences in fluids, and if they are dehydrated, they would have less water in their fat-free mass compartment. And then this is what I was talking about earlier, where the fan-based X-ray beam instead of the pencil beam will cause inaccurate results, but it will be faster than the pencil beam. And this is just a short introduction to DEXA, and this concludes our section. Okay, so unlike heat acclimation or heat acclimatization, as humans, we don't have any real physiological adaptations to cold. The best we can do is habituate to cold, which means we become less bothered by it, so to speak. We become desensitized, and there's a dampening effect of the normal response to the stressor, and in this case, it'd be cold. So if you've ever lived in a cold climate, you notice that as the weather starts to get colder and colder in the season, in the winter season, that temperature drop bothers you a little bit more than when you're in the middle or the peak of that winter season because you've already habituated to the cold. Likewise, if you fly straight from Hawaii to a cold climate, you're going to be more stressed or sensitive to that cold versus somebody who had been living in that climate and had the chance to habituate. So this is one response. Habituation is one response to being exposed to cold. So habituation is a blunted, less vigorous shivering in response to a change in ambient temperature, which TA stands for, is ambient temperature. We also exhibit two other patterns, a metabolic and an insulation pattern. The metabolic pattern refers to the fact that our metabolism increases to keep us warm because we generate heat. Remember, 70% of all energy that is used is wasted as heat. So this is going to help generate heat and keep us warm. Also, we might have more pronounced shivering and non-shivering thermogenesis in cold. So NST stands for non-shivering thermogenesis. So thermogenesis meaning the generation of heat. Non-shivering means shivering is not occurring. So this could be due to hormones such as T4 or thyroxine. The insulative pattern refers to the fact that in the cold, we are able to vasoconstrict our arterioles that serve our periphery a lot more efficiently. If we're able to do this, we'll be able to conserve our heat in our core and not let the heat transfer to our skin and dissipate into the environment. So the insulative pattern refers to our ability to vasoconstrict and keep our blood within our core and not dissipate heat into the environment. So it's most advantageous to conserve energy rather than conserve heat. So in other words, habituation is usually the most observed pattern and the best way to deal with the cold environment. And the human adaptive response to cold is weak and it's very short term. So we're not built to live in a cold climate. So exercise performance does decrease in the cold. Our cardiorespiratory endurance decreases, and there are multiple reasons. One is that if we're cold, we vasoconstrict, so this reduces blood flow. If we reduce blood flow, we're going to have less oxygen delivery, less substrate delivery, and less substrate removal from the tissue. So if we don't have oxygen delivery, we will be forced to rely more on anaerobic metabolism versus aerobic metabolism. The other reason is, if you recall, remember there are three factors that shift the oxygen dissociation, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. To the left, one being a drop in body temperature, another being an increase in pH, and the other being a change in 2,3-DPG. Well, when we're cold, that curve shifts to the left, which means we have less offloading of oxygen from hemoglobin at the steep portion of the curve or the unloading portion of the curve. So we have two main reasons why cardiorespiratory endurance decreases in the cold. One being we're vasoconstricted, we have less blood flow and therefore less oxygen delivery to the mitochondria. The second being that the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve has shifted to the left, which means we have less oxygen being delivered to myoglobin, and this forces us to rely more on anaerobic metabolism and would lead to a quicker increase in acidosis and fatigue. Our heart rate max also decreases with body cooling, where our stroke volume doesn't increase, and the AVO2 difference is going to be reduced because of the reduction in blood flow, because we've vasoconstricted, which is an insulative pattern and an insulative response to cold. So our cardiac output also decreases. So based upon research, we know that muscular endurance, strength, and muscular power also are affected by cold. So muscular endurance decreases in the cold, and it has to be the muscle temperature, not the ambient temperature. So if muscle temperature drops too low, it decreases muscular endurance, and this is related to reduced nerve conduction velocity and the recruitment of fewer muscle fibers. Muscular strength and peak power also decrease, and this is related to as the muscle cools, the sarcoplasm becomes more viscous, and therefore there's going to be increased resistance of the cross bridges of the myosin and the actin, and that has a negative effect on the generation on power and muscular strength. Also, if we recall, enzymes perform within certain limits. So when our pH falls outside certain limits, or when temperature falls outside certain limits, the chemical reactions will be slowed. So in cold, the chemical reactions are going to be slowed, and this is going to reduce the peak power muscular strength that we can develop. One more thing to think about is that since we're in the cold, we might have a metabolic pattern and start to shiver. Shivering relies solely on glucose or carbohydrates as its source of energy. So if we had shivered, this would decrease our glycogen stores, and this would lead to early onset of fatigue. Also, there's a Hobbling effect and frictional drag, and this is related to performing in cold weather. You're probably wearing big and bulky clothing, and this is going to inhibit, or this is going to have a negative impact on your performance because of the Hobbling effect and the frictional drag caused by that additional clothing that you're wearing. So AMA divers are a special example because AMA divers elicit all three types of acclimatization. And I use the word acclimatization very loosely because we know that we don't have any real adaptations to cold. And the AMA divers might be the only example of this. So AMA divers are pearl divers, and they free dive for pearls. And typically they are Korean and Japanese, and they are mother age, grandmother age, and they breath hold. And traditionally, they didn't wear neoprene suits, so they would free dive and in very, very cold water. So in a summer dive, their core temperature would drop 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and then in a winter dive, their core temp would drop almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And they are fine. This is their livelihood. So AMA divers actually elicit all three types. The insulative, meaning they vasoconstrict a lot better. Metabolic, they increase their basal metabolic rate to keep their core temperature elevated. And they've habituated to the cold, which means they have an increased tolerance to the cold and they're not shivering in the water, which would be a waste of glycogen storage. So they also have a later onset of shivering. So this is a very cool example of how humans have adapted to cold. And it's very interesting because being an AMA diver, you breath hold in the cold and they are more senior in age, which makes it really interesting to think about because there must be a genetic component to their ability to do this. So speaking of AMA divers, the heat loss in cold water is great because water has a thermal conductivity 26 times more than air. So the body will lose heat 4 times faster in water than in air. And water has a heat capacity 3,550 times of air, which means the ability of water to take your body heat away, it has a huge capacity to do this. So hypothermia can occur when the water temperature is still well above freezing and heat is lost through the head because the blood vessels on the head and the scalp are unable to vasoconstrict. So if you're ever in a situation where you are concerned about survival in water, do not submerge your head underwater because you're going to be unable to vasoconstrict those vessels and you will lose heat through your head. And we know this because on a hot summer day, and if we go to the beach, the first thing we do is submerge our head underwater because we know that it will help us cool a lot faster. So anyways, we lose a lot of heat from the head, the neck, the lateral chest wall, and the groin. So the neck, the chest wall, and groin, that's where we have large blood vessels. So the thermal neutral zone of water is about 33 to 34 degrees Celsius. So if we were to do underwater weighing, we would make sure that the water that the subject would be submerged in would be between 33 and 34 degrees Celsius because we do not want the participant to shiver. The critical water temperature is defined as the lowest temperature not associated with an increase in metabolic rate. So it's about 30 to 33 degrees Celsius for most people, and it can be as low as 28 degrees in an obese population. And of course, if you're exercising, that temperature would be a little bit lower at 25 degrees Celsius. So the bottom line is that boats that travel through waters less than 20 degrees Celsius should carry immersion suits. So other factors that would affect your survival in the cold would be the duration of your exposure, your body mass, and your BSA, your body surface area. The greater your body surface area, the greater the area to lose heat through conductivity. Also the activity level. So if you're splashing around and you are moving that water around your skin or even in air, you're going to lose more heat through convection. Your position in the water will affect your survival. Remember, submerging your head underwater would not be the best thing to do, and whether or not you have any protective clothing on. So the insulation is measured in units of clo, CLO. So 1 clo is the insulation that's required to maintain the comfort of a seated adult in a 21 degrees Celsius room or 70 degree Fahrenheit room. And it's about the insulation of a business suit. So our insulative response, remember, is our ability to vasoconstrict. So what is going to affect our ability to vasoconstrict? One is our age. As we age, as we talked about in the heat section, we talked about how as we age, it increases our risk of heat stroke or heat illness because our ability to regulate skin blood flow is reduced as we age. So aging reduces skin blood flow, and it also affects our ability to vasoconstrict. So if you've ever noticed your grandparents are either always too hot or too cold, it's because they don't have the great ability as they used to have when they were younger to vasoconstrict or vasodilate when they're hot. Also, body composition affects insulation. So body fat and metabolic rate are inversely related during cold exposure. So the greater your body fat, the lower your metabolic rate during cold exposure, and vice versa. So this is different compared to heat exposure, because if you think about the layers, the most superficial layer would be your capillaries, your arterioles, and then under that layer it would be fat. So fat, or the subcutaneous fat, is deeper than the blood, so the fat is bypassed. So it's different. The amount of subcutaneous fat is not going to be related to your ability to dissipate heat in a hot climate, but here it might, having a lot more subcutaneous fat may provide more of an insulative response in a cold climate. So the metabolic response talks about how we increase our metabolism to generate heat to keep ourselves warm. So if we look at this chart here, so 20 is maximum vasoconstriction, and then up to 35, this is our thermoneutral zone, where most people would feel comfortable. So anything greater than 35 degrees Celsius is when we would be hot, and this is where maximal vasodilation would occur to try and dissipate heat and move heat from our core to our skin. So on the other spectrum, as skin temperature drops, the first thing that would happen would be we vasoconstrict. And this would help to keep blood in our core and reduce the amount of heat that we dissipate into the environment. And then we might have some non-shivering thermogenesis, which means we have increased T4 and increased metabolism, which would increase the amount of heat and warm our body. And then there's a point at which shivering begins. And that at the onset of shivering, it depends on how well you have habituated to the cold. So remember, shivering only uses glucose as its fuel. So it's not an effective way to stay warm because you'd be wasting all your glycogen that you've stored. So the highest VO2 that was measured due to shivering with cold water immersion was 50% of somebody's VO2 max, which is pretty high. So you can imagine how quickly you would go through that glycogen if you were to shiver. So the non-shivering thermogenesis can also be related to the food metabolism or exercise. So if you recall, our resting metabolic rate is due to our physical activity, the thermogenesis of food, or the heat that's produced as we digest food. And so this is what it's talking about, where our non-shivering thermogenesis can also be related to our food metabolism or exercise, in addition to our thyroid hormones. So that we have a heavier reliance on free fatty acids in the cold. Even so we know we should have a heavier reliance on free fatty acids during low intensity steady state exercise. But in the cold, we can't rely so heavily on free fatty acids. The reason being, remember, less blood flow because we've vasoconstricted. And two, we've shifted the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve to the left, meaning we have less oxygen offloading to the myoglobin. And three, we might have used up all our glycogen due to shivering. So in the cold, even at low intensity steady state exercise, we will rely more heavily on glycogen and anaerobic glycolysis versus fat metabolism. So the wind chill is an index based on the speed of the wind and air temperature, and it was coined by an American Antarctic explorer named Paul Sipple. And the wind chill refers to the cooling power of the environment. The wind chill is not the temperature of the wind or air. It combines both the ambient temperature and the wind speed, or the ability of convective and conduction to reduce your body heat. Hypothermia is defined as a core body temperature less than 35 degrees Celsius. It is graded into different severities. So mild hypothermia is 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, and symptoms would be confusion, apathy, withdrawal, slurred speech, um, inability with complex cognitive tasks, CNS depression, impaired memory, decision making, and alertness. Any body temperature below 30 degrees, this is when shivering stops and the body becomes poikilothermic, which means the body starts to passively cool to the ambient temperature, which means the body has stopped trying to use habituation, insulative, and the metabolic patterns to keep the body warm. And then at 27 to 29 degrees Celsius, this is when coma usually happens, and VFib, ventricular fibrillation, is usually the main cause of the person not making it. So I don't know if you've heard in the news, this happened a while ago. There was a father traveling with his family, and they were lost, and they were in the snow, and they had a vehicle, but he made the mistake of leaving the vehicle to find help. And in this process, he became hypothermic, and he became confused, and he became really confused. And when he was found without any clothes, because he became so confused that he was so cold that he thought he was hot. So this is a symptom or a side effect of hypothermia, is that it alters your CNS and your ability to complete tasks. So if you're ever in that situation where you're lost in the cold, never leave your vehicle. Stay with your vehicle. So clinical hypothermia is defined as a body temperature below 34 degrees Celsius. And this is associated with uncontrolled shivering, slurred speech, alterations in consciousness, and people who do not come back from hypothermia usually undergo cardiac arrest, because hypothermia causes a slow rate of SA node firing, and this usually results in ventricular fibrillation. So there's a slowing of the rate of the neurons and myocytes to conduct electrical impulses, and also the slowing of the opening of the ion channels for the sodium and potassium to make depolarization happen. So if somebody does survive hypothermia, one thing that needs to be accounted for is the afterdrop. So say somebody was exposed to cold for an extended period of time, and now you bring that person into a warm environment. What's going to happen? So the person was cold, so they vasoconstricted a lot. And then you bring them into a warm environment, what would the arterioles do when moving a person from cold to warm? They would probably vasodilate, they would open up. And this is what's called the after drop, where even after you've moved somebody from a cold environment to a warm environment, their core body temperature might actually drop more, because now as they begun now that if they begun to warm, they start to vasodilate and they lose more heat to the environment. So the after drop refers to the worsening of a low body temperature, and it's related to the person going from a purely vasoconstricted state to a vasodilatory state, so that now instead of trying to conserve heat, the body is now releasing heat into the environment. So that is all I'm going to cover in this section. Make sure to review frostnip and frostbite, the treatment of frostbite, chilblain and perennial, trench foot and immersion foot. And that is it for this section. So heat acclimation is the process of acclimating an individual to the heat so that they adapt physiological adaptations that make their performance in the heat improved. So heat acclimation is performing a protocol in artificial conditions. So for example, in this picture, the subject is walking in an indoor environmental heat chamber. Heat acclimatization is when we naturally acclimate to a natural environment. So acclimation refers to performing it in artificial conditions. Acclimatization refers to this process occurring in a natural condition. And the same thing goes for altitude, acclimation, and acclimatization to altitude. So heat acclimation is a 10 to 14 day protocol. And if you're going to do it in an environmental chamber, you would like to have the environment warm enough to create heat stress. So in this scenario, the ambient temperature was 42 degrees dry bulb, and then 25 degrees wet bulb, which resulted in a relative humidity of about 28%. So this picture is not during heat acclimation. When you're trying to heat acclimate, you want the subject to be dressed in clothes where they would be able to evaporate their sweat, so in t-shirt and shorts. So this is from a study that we did, and we had the subject ingest a telemetric core temperature sensor capsule, which monitored their core body temperature while they were in the chamber. And this is what we used to determine their core body temperature. To ensure that they weren't dehydrated, we tested their urine color using the urine color chart. And if they were dehydrated, we asked them to drink water. We took blood samples, and then we instrumented them with skin thermistors that measure the temperature of the skin. And then we had them work in this hot chamber for 2 50-minute work bouts, broken up with a 15-minute recovery between the two. The 15-minute recovery was done in the hot chamber as well. Throughout this entire time, they could drink water ad lib, or as much as they wanted. They worked at 56% of their VO2 max. And this exercise session would be terminated if their core temperature reached a temperature of 39 degrees Celsius, if their heart rate became too high or reached 95% of their max, or they requested to stop, or they exhibited signs of exertional heat stress. And then we also asked about their thermal and comfort sensation. So what we found was that on day 1, our subjects were only able to complete 60 minutes of the 2 50-minute work bout. On day 7, all of them were able to complete the entire work bout session, indicating that their performance improved. This indicated that their ability to work in the heat or exercise in the heat increased. We took blood samples, and from pre to post exercise, so pre-exercise is in blue, post exercise is in red. From pre to post exercise, their hemoglobin and hematocrit increased. Why is that? Why do you think hematocrit and hemoglobin increased? Well, it didn't really increase. What this data is reflecting is a relative increase in the cell-based portion of the blood. This is showing us that they became dehydrated, and as they become dehydrated, the relative increase in hematocrit and hemoglobin increased. Over the next 10 days, we saw that hematocrit and hemoglobin were reduced. This indicates that their plasma volume expanded, meaning they were able now to expand their plasma volume. If you recall, we talked about fluid shifts. As we start to exercise, the oncotic pressure causes fluid to leave the extracellular space and move into the intracellular space. As we become heat acclimated or heat acclimatized, these proteins are returned through our lymph system back into our blood in higher quantities. So this initial removal or initial departure of proteins into the interstitial space, they return to the lymph, return through the lymph to the vascular space in higher quantities, and as a result, they're pulling more water into the vascular space, and this is how we're able to expand our plasma volume. From day 1 to day 10, their peak heart rate decreased. Remember, they were set or asked to work at the same absolute workload. So what this shows is that they were able to complete the same exercise workload on the 10th day with decreased cardiovascular strain. How did they do this? Well, one, they had plasma volume expansion, which allowed them to dissipate heat by moving the heat from the core to the skin. And since they had expanded plasma volume, now they could maintain an elevated or maintain an increase in venous return. So this means that heart rate could now decrease because they had enough cardiac output to support themselves during exercise. We also saw a decrease in core temperature and mean skin temperature from day 1 to day 10. And how were they able to decrease their core temperature? Well, they had a plasma volume expansion, which means now they had less competition for blood to be directed to different areas. So now they could direct blood to the skin and help to dissipate in this manner. Their sweat rate increased, and with that evaporative cooling, this reduced their core body temperature. So we have different physiological adaptations that help us to increase our work capacity in the heat with heat acclimation or heat acclimatization. Along with this, their relative perceived exertion of exercise decreased from day 1 to day 10 as well. And that's probably reflected because of the decreased cardiovascular strain that they were feeling. And they probably felt a lot cooler because now with the higher sweat rates and increased plasma volume, they were able to keep their body temperature cooler on day 10 versus day 1. So on days 1 through 5, this is when we exhibit the earliest adaptations to heat acclimation, where we exhibit an increase in plasma volume, and as a result, our heart rate decreases. And we also exhibit an earlier onset of sweating. So we start to cool the body sooner, and we have a decreased perceived exertion of exercise. On days 3 to 9, this is when most people exhibit a decrease in sodium chloride in the sweat. So the sweat becomes more dilute. They become better conservers of sweat and they become better conservers of sodium in the sweat. And as they do this, now they're reducing the risk of heat cramps, but also they're helping to retain the water retention, right? Because wherever sodium goes, water follows. So by conserving sodium, without by conserving sodium in their body, now the person is going to be better able to conserve water within their vascular space. On days 5 to 8, this is when we see an increase in sweat rate, where if we were to measure the amount of sweat a person were to lose by taking pre and post nude body weights, we would be able to see that on day 10, they would have lost much more weight due to sweat loss versus day 1. And this increase in sweat rate is going to help keep their body cooler because remember, evaporative cooling is the main mechanism of heat dissipation. And then days 10 to 14 is when the maximized exercise capacity is seen in most individuals. So from days 4 to 7, 75 to 80% of all the adaptations to heat are attained. So this is Pablo's story. Pablo was a Mexican horseman who became lost in the desert, and he wandered in the desert for 8 days and traveled 35 miles on horseback, 100 miles on foot on 2 gallons of water under cloudless conditions. So when he was found, his tongue and skin were black and desiccated. He was deaf to all but loud sounds and blind to all light and dark. His heart rate was slow, and his pulse could not be detected below his knees or elbow. But even though he lost nearly 40% of his body weight, 18 liters of water, he made a remarkable recovery. His vision and hearing were restored, which tells us that he must have been well acclimatized to the heat, and he behaved in a way that gave him the maximal opportunity to survive. So in class, this is when I usually give examples of how comparative physiology has taught us what the best way is to survive in the desert. So for example, camels in the desert, they, if you notice, if they go down on their quote unquote knees, their knees are the only thing in contact with the ground. So this minimizes their um, their body heat gain through conductive heat gain, right? The direct molecular contact of their legs against the ground. Also, their fur allows them to have a wide variance of temperature from the tip of the fur to the start or the surface of the skin. And this allows them to keep their bodies cool or cooler in the desert. And there is one more thing, one more behavioral behavioral adaptation that they have is that they are always facing the sun. So if you notice, if you've ever seen a picture of a camel or if you've noticed camels in the habitat, that they face the sun. And when they face the sun, they limit the amount of radiation that their body is absorbing. So I like to use comparative physiology in these classes because one, they're very interesting. And two, this is where scientists gain a lot of insight into how humans who have a very small range of survivability when we talk about body temperature, fluid, pH, how humans can better survive extreme environments. Okay, so heat acclimation is when we expose ourselves to heat while we exercise in an artificial environment, and heat acclimatization occurs in a natural climate. So this would be if we were to actually exercise outside in the heat for multiple days, as maybe as of a conditioning, part of conditioning in sport before we enter the competitive season. So we must exercise in the heat to achieve full heat acclimation or acclimatization. So passive sitting in the sauna does not result in the same effects. So the adaptations that we gain occur through different pathways when we sit passively in the heat versus when we exercise in the heat. We have small sex differences between women or females and males. Females typically have lower sweat rates and they have better feedback. So in a female, if they start to sweat a lot and the feedback from the skin signals that the sweat is rolling off the skin and therefore not being evaporated off the skin, that the female will be able to reduce her sweat rate. Of course, this is not under voluntary control, and this is through sensory and efferent feedback through the CNS. Also, women have more active sweat glands, but produce less sweat per gland. This may be disadvantage. This may be a disadvantage in a hot, dry environment, but this would be an advantage in a hot, humid environment where she would conserve her sweat and not sweat in a wasteful way where evaporation would not occur. So there have been some studies out there that suggest that caffeine should not be consumed due to its diuretic effects, and therefore it would have a negative effect on our ability to thermoregulate. So research suggests that caffeine results in a mild increase in the production of urine, and there's no evidence that moderate caffeine consumption would induce chronic dehydration or impair our temperature regulation. And sometimes, or in some instances, caffeine actually can help to increase our exercise performance by helping our motivation, by giving us energy, by ramping us up. So as we age, skin blood flow is reduced, which means people who are older are going to have a harder time thermoregulating. So older men and women have reduced skin blood flow, which means if they have less skin blood flow to the skin, their evaporative cooling, their conductive and convective cooling are going to be reduced. So this means that as we age, our risk of heat illness increases. So this graph is showing the number of deaths from heat stroke, and you can see in the population starting from about 75 to 90 years of age, this is where we see a big increase in deaths related to heat stroke. And this is related to their impaired ability to thermoregulate. And that brings us to the end of this section. In this section, I'm going to talk about heat-related disorders, and this slide shows heat-related disorders from least to most severe. So heat cramps is our least severe heat-related disorder, and it is due most likely to large sodium losses without the sodium being replenished. So in other words, extreme water loss through sweating, but the subject or athlete has replenished with water alone and not replenished with water and salt. So heat cramps usually results from electrolyte imbalances in the muscle. And it's most common in heavy sweaters who are poor sodium conservers, meaning people who are not heat acclimated or heat acclimatized. Prickly heat is the inflammation of sweat glands and red welts, and this also occurs in unacclimated or untrained people moving to a hot environment. Heat exhaustion is the next serious heat illness, and the symptoms include dizziness, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, and even fainting. In heat exhaustion, core body temperature can still be below 39 degrees Celsius. So 39 degrees Celsius is usually set or usually used as a critical threshold for which anything above this is typically related to heat stroke. So in heat exhaustion, your thermoregulatory mechanisms are still functional, but the subject or athlete cannot dissipate heat quickly enough. So the treatment for this would to remove the subject or athlete into a shaded environment, elevate the feet. If the person is conscious, have them ingest salted water. And if they're unconscious, to start an IV administration of saline solution. Heat stroke is the most life-threatening heat disorder, and it's characterized by an internal core temperature of greater than 40 degrees Celsius. And the main symptom or sign is lack of mental acuity. So if you suspect heat stroke, ask your athlete questions, simple questions, which they know the answer to, or try and hold a conversation with them. If they're unable to hold a coherent conversation with you, this indicates they have altered mental status. And it is a symptom or effect of heat stroke. So the treatment for this would be whole body immersion in ice water. The second option to that would be dousing the individual with water with rapid fanning to encourage evaporation and conductive and convective heat loss. Ice packs on local areas such as the armpits, neck, and groin are ineffective in lowering core body temperature because of the small region that it's affecting, and also applying a cold pack to the skin would cause those arterioles to vasoconstrict because they're being exposed to cold. And when we're trying to dissipate heat, we need those arterioles to open up. So that is the reason why local ice packs at different regions on the body are ineffective in the treatment of heat stroke. So this graph is showing that the most effective way to cool, and it has the highest cooling rate, is total body immersion in ice water. And this requires the person who's treating to circulate the water around the athlete to make sure that the cooling is still occurring and that the warm water or the warmer water is not sitting next to the person's skin. And then you'll see on this far left-hand side, ice packs has the lowest cooling rate. So athletic trainers are required to have a tarp handy in case they need to make a makeshift kiddie pool where they can submerge an athlete in ice water. Again, if having a tarp on hand is not available, then it would be moving the athlete into the shade, dousing them with water with rapid fanning, multiple people fanning the athlete. And this is the end of the heat illness section. The next video that I will record will be one on heat acclimation. This is chapter 13, exercise at altitude. So just a little bit of history. In 1644, Torricelli developed the mercury barometer. In 1648, it was discovered that barometric pressure decreases with altitude. In the 1700s, it was discovered that oxygen and other gases contribute to barometric pressure. In 1875, the first balloon fatalities were reported, and actually in the 1880s, scientific research started to describe the effects of altitude and hypoxia on survival. So we know today that moving to altitude affects barometric pressure, and it's this barometric pressure which is going to affect the partial pressure of oxygen. So we know barometric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury, and barometric pressure is the pressure exerted on us by the atmosphere, and this pressure is exerted on our body in all directions. So at sea level, if we wanted to determine the partial pressure of oxygen, all we would have to do was multiply our barometric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury, by 21%, which is the percentage of oxygen in atmospheric air. And we would get a partial pressure of 159 millimeters of mercury. As we move to altitude, barometric pressure drops, and as a result, the partial pressure of oxygen drops. And this is when it becomes problematic. In hypobaria, or in conditions with low barometric pressure as seen at altitude, this results in hypoxia, meaning the oxygen content in the atmosphere in the atmospheric air around us is low, and it can result in hypoxemia or low oxygen content in the blood. This term hypoxemia should look familiar. We talked about it in exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. And we talked about it in the section where we were discussing that the pulmonary system rarely limits exercise performance, except in the case of elite athletes who have very, very high cardiac outputs. And this very high cardiac output means their pulmonary circulation, or the blood flow through the pulmonary circulation, happens very rapidly. And this reduces the contact time between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. So the O2-CO2 exchange doesn't happen. And in this scenario, the athlete would be circulating deoxygenated blood. And this is why it's called exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia, because hypoxemia means low partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood. So this is also a review, Dalton's law of partial pressures, which states that the total pressure, in our case barometric pressure, is equal to the sum of the partial pressures. So if we took the barometric pressure and multiplied it by 21%, which represents oxygen, 79%, which represents nitrogen, and 0.03%, which is CO2, we can determine the partial pressure of each gas. If we added these numbers back up, they would equal 760 millimeters of mercury. So now as we move to altitude, we can do the same thing and multiply the new barometric pressure of 560 millimeters of mercury, and we will see that the partial pressure of oxygen is reduced. And this is the problem, or this is the concern. It's not that the amount of oxygen in the air is reduced, because it's still 21%. The issue is that the barometric pressure has been reduced, resulting in a reduced partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. So we define sea level as anything less than 500 meters, and there's no effect on performance. Low altitude is defined as 500 to 2,000 meters, and there's no effects on well-being, but performance may be reduced. Oftentimes, if performance is reduced, it can be restored by acclimation or acclimatization to altitude. Moderate altitude is defined as 2,000 to 3,000 meters. And at moderate altitude, effects on the well-being in unacclimated people exist. Not everyone, but it is common. And the performance and aerobic capacity is reduced. So at the elite level, a 1% impairment in performance is significant. So this is a huge concern for athletes who are performing at altitude, because altitude can turn great players into good players, and at least in terms of their performance. So setting your athlete up or client up for performance at altitude is important, just because there is a process that needs to happen in order for us to be acclimated to altitude. So high altitude is defined as 3,000 to 5,500 meters, and this is when acute mountain sickness can occur. There's a definite decline in performance, and this decline is not often restored by acclimation. Extreme high altitude is anything greater than 5,500 meters, and at this altitude is where we see severe hypoxic effects. The highest human settlements are 52 to 5,800 meters at high, so at altitude. And that's actually the upper limit of human habitation. So we'll see in a different section how these highlanders survive. Their physiology is different, meaning their thoracic cavity is going to be a bigger proportion in comparison to their total body versus lowlanders. Their hematocrit's going to be higher. So their physiology is going to be quite different from lowlanders, which allow them to reside at altitude. So for our purposes for the class, we'll define altitude as anything greater than 1,500 meters. So I just want to reiterate that the concern is not the low percentage of oxygen in the air, it's the low partial pressure of oxygen in the air. Although they may sound like the same thing, it's not exactly the same thing because the percentage of oxygen remains the same at 21%, and what changes is that barometric pressure. And if that barometric pressure drops, the partial pressure of oxygen also drops. And if that partial pressure of oxygen drops, that means less oxygen will be delivered to our working skeletal muscles. So to reiterate that statement, so we have a comparison of different cities at sea level, at moderate altitude, and then extreme altitude. The barometric pressure, you can see it drops as we move into altitude. The percentage of oxygen in the air remains exactly the same, but when we multiply these two numbers, we can see that the partial pressure of oxygen in the air decreases very drastically from 159 millimeters of mercury to 53 millimeters of mercury at the top of Mount Everest. And as you can also see, as we move up into altitude, temperatures, ambient temperatures decline. So what does this mean? As we move up to altitude, temperatures drop. As temperatures drop, our air becomes less humid. It becomes drier. So with the drier air, we're going to lose more water, insensible water loss through our respiration and skin. So at altitude, the risk of dehydration, although it's cool and we might not have the urge to drink, it's still very possible to become dehydrated just because, one, it's cold, we're not motivated to drink, and two, at rest, we're going to lose a lot more water through our respiration and through our skin through insensible water loss. Also at altitude, the solar radiation is much higher because the UV rays travel through less atmosphere. Also, water normally absorbs sun radiation, but with such low water pressures at altitude, the air becomes, or the air is less able to absorb the sun's radiation. Also, the snow reflects and amplifies the solar radiation. So you know if you've ever gone skiing or snowboarding, that you still need to apply a lot of sunscreen. So this is the end of this section. And the next section, we're going to talk about physiological responses and adaptations to altitude. In this section, we are going to talk about the physiological responses to acute altitude exposure. Acute meaning short-term impact. What happens when we arrive at altitude? The first thing that will happen is that we'll start to hyperventilate. Our pulmonary ventilation increases almost immediately. And the reason for this is because, as we talked about in the previous section, the barometric pressure is reduced at altitude, which reduces the atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen, which in turn decreases the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen, how much oxygen in our alveoli or our lung. And this in turn causes a reduction of oxygen in the arterial blood being circulated in the systemic circulation. So this results in a low partial pressure of oxygen within the blood. And this is detected by the chemoreceptors in our aortic arch. The chemoreceptors send a sensory message, an afferent message to the CNS, and the CNS responds with an efferent message to increase ventilation. So this increased ventilation is accomplished by increasing both tidal volume and frequency. So tidal volume can be increased for several hours or days. And remember, minute ventilation is equal to frequency times tidal volume. So by increasing one or both of the factors, tidal volume or frequency, minute ventilation increases. When we increase minute ventilation, we start to hyperventilate, and this causes us to blow off too much CO2. And if you recall in a different section, we talked about how CO2 content is an important regulator of pH, where if we have too much CO2 buildup, this causes acidosis and pH drops. If we have too little CO2, this causes us to become alkaline and pH increases. So in this case, we start to hyperventilate, we blow off too much CO2, we become alkaline, pH increases. So what we're going to talk about in this section is that the partial pressures of CO2 and O2 are a result of the low barometric pressure, and it's not a result of reduced function of the actual system. So this curve should look familiar. This is the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve, where the blue line is that baseline curve. And we talked about different factors which can shift the curve to the left or right. So at altitude, our body temperature drops, our pH increases because we're hyperventilating, and this causes a leftward shift of the curve. This means that we're going to have more binding of oxygen to hemoglobin at the lung in the loading portion, but at the tissue level, hemoglobin is going to bind more tightly to oxygen and give oxygen up less readily to myoglobin. So this results in less oxygen delivery at the tissue level. In addition, the kidneys will excrete more bicarbonate. And if you recall, we talked about how hydrogen ion combines with bicarbonate to create carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can then dissociate into water and CO2, and that CO2 is what we blow out at the mouth. So this has a hydrogen ion sparing effect, where if there's no bicarbonate for that hydrogen ion to bind to, then it inhibits us from getting rid of more CO2. So by the kidneys excreting bicarbonate, it helps us to keep the hydrogen ions in our body because it doesn't give the hydrogen ion an option to bind to it and then to be expelled from the body. So at rest, pulmonary diffusion is not limited by its ability to diffuse gas as far as dysfunction of the lung. The main factor is that low alveolar partial pressure that is a result of the low atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen. So hypoxemia, or low oxygen content in the arterial blood, is a direct reflection of low alveolar partial pressure of oxygen. At the same time, we have less oxygen being delivered to the muscles because of that leftward shift of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. We also talked about two other reasons why oxygen delivery is reduced. One being we have a decrease in blood flow because we're vasoconstricted. So less oxygen can be delivered to the muscles because of the reduced blood flow. And then the third being related to the reduction of the diffusion gradient of oxygen at the lung level and then also at the tissue level. So to talk about that a little bit more, we're going to use this figure. This figure should look familiar. The left-hand panel we've seen in a different section, where at sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is 159, where we just got this number by multiplying the barometric pressure by 21%. And then at the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen drops to 104 millimeters of mercury, and this drop is a result of us subtracting out the water vapor pressure. And then the 105 or 104 millimeter of mercury is going to drop to 100, and this is a result of the direct oxygen use of the lungs or the pulmonary system. So by the time the arterial blood is circulated through the systemic circulation, the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of oxygen leaving the tissues is 40, and this leaves us with a gradient of 60 millimeters of mercury, where we just subtract 100 minus 40. So let's take a look at altitude. At altitude, if we were to multiply the barometric pressure by 21%, we would get 96 millimeters of mercury. Subtract out water vapor pressure, and we would get 46 millimeters of mercury. Subtract out the oxygen going to supply the lung itself, and this leaves us with a partial pressure of oxygen of 42 millimeters of mercury. So the O2 content of the blood leaving the tissue is 27. So by subtracting 42 minus 27, we get a diffusion gradient of 15. So if you recall, if you think back to the Fick's law of diffusion, this law said that the rate of diffusion is going to be dependent upon three things. One being the surface area, the other being the thickness of the membrane, and the third being the diffusion gradient, the difference in the partial pressure. So according to Fick's law, the amount of oxygen that's going to be diffused across the tissue at altitude is going to be reduced because we have a reduction in this diffusion gradient. So in other words, at the tissue level, less oxygen is going to be delivered to the muscles because of a reduced oxygen gradient. So combined with the other factors of a leftward shift of the oxygen dissociation curve resulting in less oxygen delivery, and combined with the reduced blood flow because we're vasoconstricted, the end product is that less oxygen is going to be delivered to the muscle. And as a result, even though we're at rest or performing low intensity exercise, we are going to rely heavily on anaerobic metabolism because of these different factors. So the fact that this gradient is less or smaller at the tissue is critical because this has a direct impact on our exercise capacity, where less oxygen is going to be delivered to our mitochondria. So this is another figure of the hemoglobin dissociation curve, just illustrating the leftward shift of the curve, where more oxygen will be picked up by hemoglobin, but less oxygen will be delivered to the myoglobin at the tissue level. So other responses include a drop in plasma volume within a few hours. And this is caused by a few factors. One being since we're at altitude, the air is drier. Since we're hyperventilating, we're losing more insensible water loss through our respiratory tract. Also, as we vasoconstrict because we're cold, the venous return is going to increase to the heart. The atrial baroreceptors are going to detect this increase in pressure. And as a result, they're going to release ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, which, if you recall, works in opposition or has opposite effects of aldosterone. So ANP is going to cause diuresis, and this is directly going to impact plasma volume, where plasma volume will be reduced. So we could lose up to 25% of our plasma volume. So this will result in a short-term increase in hematocrit, where if we take that column of blood and we reduce our plasma volume, our hematocrit has now relatively increased in relation to that total blood volume. However, our hematocrit itself has not yet increased. Our hematocrit will increase, but this takes about this takes weeks to months to occur. So the hypoxemia, or the low oxygen content in the blood triggers erythropoietin release from the kidneys. And as you remember, this increases red blood cell production in the bone marrow and results in a long-term increase in hematocrit. So at altitude, our stroke volume, our maximal stroke volume is going to be reduced because we have a reduction in plasma volume. Our maximum heart rate is going to be reduced due to a decrease in sympathetic nervous system response. So the overall impact is a reduction in maximal cardiac output. And if you recall, if you think back to the Fick's equation where VO2 is equal to cardiac output times the AVO2 difference, so VO2 is equal to Q times the AVO difference. This is the reason why VO2 max decreases at altitude, because we have a reduction in both cardiac output, our maximal cardiac output, and we have a reduction in AVO2 difference due to that reduced oxygen diffusion gradient that we just talked about. We also have an increase in basal metabolic rate. This is due to T4 thyroxine. We also, our HPA axis may also be stressed, and our catecholamine secretion will also go up. So this means that our caloric expenditure at rest is increased at altitude. So we must increase the amount of calories or food we eat to maintain our body mass. And the calories should come mainly from carbohydrates, since we have shifted our reliance mainly on carbohydrates versus fat because we have less oxygen being delivered to the tissue level. So since we have this shift or heavy reliance on anaerobic metabolism, we would be led to believe that lactic acid would increase. However, what happens at altitude is lactic acid production decreases over time. And this is what we call the lactate paradox. Paradox meaning it goes against what we believe, it doesn't quite make sense, and we don't have an answer to explain this phenomenon. So this is the lactate paradox, where according to everything we just covered, and anaerobic metabolism would be heavily used, we believe lactic acid would increase. But what happens at altitude is that lactate production decreases over time. So this table summarizes everything we talked about, where it outlines the adaptations or physiological responses to altitude for each system. So for example, the pulmonary system, we talked about increased ventilation, and this happens through increased frequency and tidal volume. We talked about the leftward shift in the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, and we talked about our pH increasing and we becoming more alkaline as a result of the low partial pressure being detected by our chemoreceptors, which then stimulate hyperventilation. At the heart, we have a decreased plasma volume due to the ANP stimulation and an increased respiratory water loss, and this causes a decrease in stroke volume. So heart rate at rest is going to be elevated. So don't worry about these two bullet points that are X'd out. The metabolic system is going to be affected by an increased metabolic rate and a decreased AVO2 difference. And this is due to the decreased partial pressure difference between arterial blood and venous blood. So as a result of a decreased oxygen delivery, we're going to rely more heavily on carbohydrates for energy. And then the lactate paradox states that lactic acid increases, but it eventually starts to decrease over time at altitude. Our kidneys help to maintain pH by excreting bicarbonate ions. So this helps to reduce pH levels, and it helps to conserve the amount of hydrogen ions in our body. It also increases red blood cell production by the kidneys' release of erythropoietin, and also the kidneys' diurese and this is a result of ANP released from the heart, or the atrial. So at altitude, dehydration occurs faster because of our hyperventilation. So we're losing a lot more water through our respiratory tract. And this is insensible, so we don't sense this. Also, our kidneys are excreting more urine. And with sweating, we are going to become dehydrated quicker. But since the air is very dry at altitude, the sweat that we do sweat is going to be evaporated quickly. So we're not going to sense, or we're not going to be able to detect our actual sweat rate. So we won't be able to balance our hydration. So this is one of the reasons why dehydration occurs faster at altitude. Our appetite also declines at altitude, so paired this with an increase in metabolism, this could result in caloric deficit each day. So climbers and mountaineers need to be educated about eating and hydrating at altitude. And then maintenance of iron intake would also be important to support the increase in hematocrit. So Mount Everest, also known as Nepal in Siddhartha, and in Tibet as Kwomalongma, is the Earth's highest mountain. So if we were to measure your VO2 max on Mount Everest, which falls off this chart, it would be probably about 30 to 40% of your actual VO2 max if it was measured at sea level. So Denver's mile high, and so you would expect your VO2 max to be a little bit lower in Denver when compared to sea level. And as we increase in altitude, for example, Pikes Peak, your VO2 max would be expected to be 70% of what it was or what it was measured at sea level. And then Mount Everest would be less than half of your VO2 max. So VO2 max drops dramatically as we ascend to altitude past 1,500 meters. And this is due to all of the factors that we've just covered, the cardiovascular, the metabolic, the renal, and the ventilation. So if you ever have a goal, or if you have a goal of hiking Mount Everest, the minimum sea level VO2 max that you must have is 50 mLs per kg per minute. And in this case, you should be able to climb the mountain without supplemental oxygen. So say if you measured your VO2 max at sea level, your VO, and it was 62 mLs per kg per minute, at the top of Mount Everest, you could expect your VO2 max to be measured at 15 mLs per kg per minute, which at sea level, if this was your VO2 max, this would be equivalent to a cardiovascular patient, a patient with compromised cardiorespiratory function. So although your endurance performance would be drastically affected at altitude, your anaerobic performance may be unaffected, and then in some instances, it may even be enhanced. So for example, for a 100 or 400 meter track sprint, your anaerobic performance may not be different at altitude, but you might even have improved times due to less air resistance. So improved jump distances may also result. So high jump, long jump, throwing events will have varied effects, where maybe the discus will have a worsened effect due to the lack of air lift or lift caused by the air. The javelin may be increased or decreased as well. Okay, so this is the end of this section. So the data that I just showed you was based upon BMI, or body mass index. And using this data, we know that 33% of US adult women are obese and 28% of US adult men are obese. Obesity is more prevalent in African American women than Hispanic and Caucasians. So 25 to 40% of the variability in body fatness is attributed to genetics. This still leaves a great deal, 75%, is going to be determined by the environment In this section, we're going to cover field-based methods of body composition, and the first method is anthropometry. We did anthropometry in Lab 1 in 354 lab, where we measured different circumferences, such as the hip and the waist. The anthropometric equations that are available use circumferences as predictors to estimate the body fatness of a person. And anthropometric measurements, specifically waist and hip circumferences, are the best way to measure body composition in the obese population. The assumptions of this measurement is that the circumferences are affected by fat mass, muscle mass, and skeletal mass, and therefore these measures are related to fat mass and lean body mass. So the circumferences are going to be the best way to measure body composition or estimate body composition in the obese population. It's also an easy way to measure weight loss or body fat loss in all populations if you don't have the body composition supplies and tools required for other field-based methods. So in males, if they have a waist circumference greater than 102 centimeters, this puts them at an increased risk for coronary heart disease and metabolic disease. Females with a waist circumference greater than 88 centimeters also have an increased risk for coronary heart disease and metabolic diseases. In lab, we also measured neck circumference, where this was related to sleep apnea, and the cutoffs are listed below, and were also listed in that first lab. Sagittal abdominal diameter is a measure of an anterior posterior thickness of the abdomen. So you would use a caliper that looked like this and place one side of the caliper at the umbilicus level and the other side posterior on the back of the person. And the width of the openness of the jaw would be measured, and this would be a measure of the sagittal abdominal diameter. So it's basically a depth measurement. This is strongly related to visceral adipose tissue in men and women, and it's also related to metabolic disease and cardiovascular disease risk. Body mass index is another field-based test that we did in Lab 1. It's also known as Quetelet's index. It's defined as weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. These cutoffs are something that you should know. If you're going to stay in this field, they will be very important for you to have at your disposal. So a BMI greater than 30 kilograms per meter square would classify an individual as obese. A BMI greater than 25 kilograms per meter squared would classify somebody as overweight. And an underweight BMI would be anything less than 18.5 kilograms per meter square. So to do this calculation, we've done this in class, but to review, what we do is take their weight, convert it to kilograms, and take their height, convert it to meters, and then plug and chug. So when we put in the numbers and calculate it, this person has a BMI of 24.2 kilograms per meter square, and this places them in a normal category. They are right on the cusp of being categorized as overweight, but in this case, they would still be classified as normal. Waist to hip ratio is another good measure of body composition, where we can classify somebody as having an android or pear-shaped body. An apple or android-shaped body is associated with excess fat around the abdomen, which is common in men. And there's a significant correlation with visceral fat in the abdomen with metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome being a collection of diseases, including cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension. Pear or gynoid-shaped bodies are pear-shaped where excess fat is carried around the thighs and the buttocks. And this is common in women. And this is not associated with an increased risk of metabolic syndrome. So these are the normative values for waist circumference and BMI. They're also listed in your ACSM guidelines book. For the test, you will be responsible for knowing the BMI cutoffs for underweight, normal, and overweight. You do not have to know the obesity classes. You just need to know that anything greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared is classified as obese. Again, the waist circumferences are something that you also need to know, where the cutoff for men is 102 centimeters and the cutoff for women is 88 centimeters. So if the waist circumference of a man or woman falls above the cutoff range, it increases their risk of coronary artery disease, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes. So if you're placed in an overweight or obese category, this is associated with, as I mentioned earlier, an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, dyslipidemia, which means a dysregulation of lipids in the blood. So this is usually high triglycerides, high cholesterol, high LDL, and low HDL, LDL being the bad cholesterol and HDL being the good cholesterol. It's also associated with hypertension, glucose intolerance, which is type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, diabetes, and cancer. Being classified as underweight is associated with fluid electrolyte imbalances, osteoporosis, and bone fractures, because remember, the way we build bone is by adding stress to that bone, and having a body weight that supports weight-bearing activities that stress the bone is going to increase bone mass density. On the other hand, if a person is underweight, not getting enough nutrients, this would result in osteoporosis and bone fractures. Being underweight is also associated with muscle wasting, cardiac arrhythmias. The cardiac arrhythmias are related to the fluid electrolyte imbalances in sodium, potassium, and calcium. Being underweight is also associated with sudden death, peripheral edema, reproductive and renal disorders. So there is a problem with BMI because BMI does not distinguish between muscle mass and fat mass. So there's no way to tell using BMI if the weight is associated with lean body mass, which is healthy, or fat mass, which is not healthy. This is the end of this field-based body composition section. A new video will be uploaded for the lab-based body composition. So in the previous section, we talked about why BMI or body mass index is not a good indicator of body composition because it only takes into account body mass, and we can't differentiate if that mass is coming from fat mass or fat-free mass. So in this section, we're going to cover different methods of assessing body composition. There are different compartment models that can be used. In this section, we're only going to talk about that 2-compartment model, where we're going to be able to break down the body into either a fat mass component or fat-free mass component. There are other models out there, such as a chemical model, which would break down the body into different chemical elements. So for example, for the fat component, this would include both adipose tissue and the fat, the essential fat of the cell membranes. In the anatomical model, this breaks down the body into functional compartments. So it'll break it down into the organs, the muscles, the adipose tissue, and bone. So again, in this section, we're going to be using the 2-compartment model, where we're going to assume the body is going to be broken down into fat mass and fat-free mass. There is a difference between fat-free mass and lean body mass. Fat-free mass is the mass of the body that has 0 fat. Lean body mass is the mass of the body that includes the essential fat of the body, for example, cell membranes. So be sure you're able to discern between the two fat mass, the fat-free mass, and the lean body mass definitions. Again, lean body mass includes essential mass or essential body fat, and the fat-free mass contains zero fat. There are assumptions of this two-compartment model, one being that the densities of fat and the fat-free mass components are additive and the same in everyone. We know that this is not true. For example, in African Americans, we know that their bone density is denser than the bone density of Asians, for example. Another assumption is that the proportions of water, mineral, and protein in fat-free mass are constant within and between individuals, which we also know there are ethnic and racial differences. And each tissue type represents a constant proportion of fat-free mass. In this section, we're going to examine hydrostatic weighing or underwater weighing, which is the gold standard, and air plethysmography. These two methods use density in its methodology. So the first method we're going to talk about is the underwater weighing or hydrostatic weighing. This is based upon Archimedes' principle. Archimedes was a Greek mathematician who was asked by his cousin, King Hero, to determine if the goldsmith had cheated him out of gold. King Hero had asked the goldsmith to create a laurel leaf crown out of gold. When he heard rumors that the goldsmith may have replaced some of the gold with a cheaper metal, he was furious, and so he asked his cousin Archimedes to determine if the crown was pure gold. So presented with this problem, Archimedes thought about how to solve this problem. When he entered the bathtub, this is how the story goes. When he entered the bathtub, the water spilled out over the sides because his body had displaced the water. And then he realized he found the solution and he shouted, "Eureka, eureka." He knew that density is equal to mass divided by volume because he was a Greek mathematician. So if we could determine density by taking the mass of the crown and dividing it by the volume of the crown, we could determine density. And he had discovered by displacing water, he can determine the volume of the crown. So how we apply this in densitometry and underwater weighing is that an object submerged in water is acted on a buoyant force equal to the weight of the water it displaces. So for example, we have a 5-kilogram weight that was measured in air or on land, and then we submerge it underwater, and now we can see that the weight is 3 kilograms. The water that was displaced by submerging the weight was 2 kilograms, which essentially is 2 liters of water. So you'll notice that the difference between 5 and 3 is 2. So the volume of this weight is 2 liters. And we determine this by taking the difference of the mass in air and subtract the mass underwater. So when we apply this to our body, we're able to determine our body density. We use the equation density is equal to mass divided by volume. So we know our body mass on land, we can measure that with a scale. And then we use the underwater weight to determine body volume. This is the equation that is given to you on your lab worksheet, where the body density, abbreviated dB, is equal to the mass of the body on land divided by the body volume, which is this entire denominator here. So the mass in air minus the mass of water is your volume, but we need to account for the density of water. The density of water is going to be dependent upon the temperature. So this chart shows you the relationship between water temperature and density, where the higher the temperature, the lower the density. So in water that is 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26.7 degrees Celsius, this corresponds with a density of 0.98 grams per cubic centimeter. We also need to take into account residual volume and the GI tract volume, or the gastrointestinal tract. Remember, when we exhale all of our air, we still have some air left in our lungs, and this is what we call residual volume. Residual volume is based upon the person's age, height, gender, and smoking status. We have a chart that we will use in lab to estimate the person's residual volume based upon their age and height. And then for the GI tract, for adults, we assume it's 100 mLs. So if we're able to determine the person's mass underwater, the other variables in this equation are known, and then we can solve for body density. Once we get body density, we will plug them into a body fat equation, and this is called the Siri equation. There are many equations out there that can be used. This equation was derived from Caucasians. So if your subject is Caucasian, it makes sense to use this equation. Your ACSM guidelines to exercise prescription and exercise book on page 78, table 4.3, will give you a list of equations that are going to be specific to your subject of different ethnicities. And you'll find that the Filipino and Hispanic ethnicities are underrepresented in that section. Just because the way those equations are derived are from testing people of that same ethnicity across an age range, and you have to have a certain number of subjects per age. So if that demographic is not available to the researcher, then developing these equations is not possible. So we're going to take an example of Craig and Brad. They are both the same height. They both weigh the same on land, but their mass underwater is different, where Craig is 5 kilograms underwater and Brad is 3.5 kilograms underwater. From this, we can determine that Craig is denser because he's heavier underwater, which we would assume correctly that his body fat would be lower because fat is buoyant, and the fact that he's heavier underwater suggests that he has more muscle mass or lean body mass. To determine their body volume, remember, we're going to just take their mass on land and subtract their underwater weight. And so the volume of Craig is 88 liters. And then for Brad, it's 89.5 liters, where we took 93 minus 3.5. So if we were to take these data and plug and chug, we would confirm that Craig indeed does have a higher body density of 1.0485, whereas Brad has a body density of 1.0307 kilograms per liter. So Craig is denser, meaning he has less body fat. When you guys do these equations in lab, do not round off your numbers, because you notice that we carried out the numbers as far as we could. So do not round it off, because it would result in inaccurate body fat numbers. Okay, so once we have the body density, now we can plug it into the percentage of body fat equation. So who has a larger body density? Craig does. So who would have more percentage of body fat? Brad would. Okay, so now we can plug into the Siri equation. We're assuming they're both Caucasian and they're male, so we're going to use the appropriate equation. And we can conclude that Craig has a percentage of body fat of 22.1 and Brad has 30.2% body fat. So since we're using the two-compartment model, we can now determine how much of their body mass is fat mass or fat-free mass. And all we're going to do is multiply their fat percentage by their mass. So Brad's fat mass is 28.1 kilograms, and his fat-free mass would just be his body weight and subtract out his fat mass. So you can see how the two-compartment model is applied, where we take the percentage of body fat, multiply it by their body weight, and that absolute weight or mass represents their fat mass. And when you take this mass and you subtract it from their entire body weight, you would determine their fat-free mass. And I just found that this is a typo here. So this should be 20.6 kilograms in this blank. Okay, so the residual volume is the largest contributor to error. Also, the technical error in the sense that the subject would have to expel all their air possible, because not expelling all of their air would make them more buoyant, make their underwater weight lighter, and make them look fatter than they really are. Also, this age, sex, and race affects the density of the fat-free mass. So being sure to also use the correct equation would help. Use the correct body fat equation would help. The guidelines for hydrostatic weighing would be not to eat 4 hours prior to testing. Of course, to avoid eating gaseous foods, which will make you more buoyant. We would calibrate the scales, which you'll see in a video that I will upload into the lab section. And we would want to get 2 underwater weights within 100 grams of each other. Ideally, would measure residual volume, but in this lab, we do estimate it with that chart dependent upon the subject's height and age. Weigh females outside the perceived peak body weight during their menstrual cycle, and carry the body density value out to 5 decimal places. Do not round any number. So the next method is the BODPOD, or air plethysmography. It's similar to the underwater weighing technique, where instead of using water, in this case, we're going to use air to determine body volume. So the volume is measured by air displacement from this person sitting in the BODPOD. And this also has the same assumptions of the 2-compartment model. So the reason why the person must wear a swimsuit and swim cap is because of the pressure changes, or the volume changes as a result of temperature of the air. So if you think of a person sitting in the BODPOD, the air that is closest to their skin is going to be warmer than the air that is furthest from them. The air that is closest to them is going to be warm, which is going to make it more compressible. And this is going to alter the machine's calculation of the person's body volume. So likewise, wearing bulky clothing would trap air close to the skin and make that air close to the skin more compressible, and it would underestimate the person's body volume. If you underestimate the person's body volume, it would increase the density of that person. So this is the reason why they need to wear a swimsuit. Ideally, not have any facial hair, because facial hair will underestimate percentage of body fat by about 8%, which is negligible. And wear a swim cap to keep the hair closest to the scalp, because we don't want to increase the amount of compressible air around the head. So to explain this a little bit more. So if we know that the density is equal to mass divided by volume. So if we decrease volume with the bulky clothing, right? So if we wear bulky clothing, the air around the skin is going to become more compressible, and it's going to underestimate the person's body volume. As a result, as this denominator gets smaller and smaller, what's going to happen to density? It's going to increase density. And as we increase density, what would happen to body fat? it would underestimate body fat, right? Because the more dense you are, the less body fat you have. So this is why the subject must wear a swimsuit and a swim cap, and ideally not have facial hair. So the bod pod works when the person sits in the front chamber, and there is a diaphragm which oscillates that creates small volume changes opposite in direction. And using the bod pod, we're able to determine the person's body volume. So unlike the underwater weighing, where we ask the subject to completely submerge themselves and exhale all of their air, the person in the bod pod just sits, and we need to estimate their thoracic gas volume. So the thoracic gas volume is similar to underwater weighings, residual volume, and GI tract volume. So like underwater weighing, which you will see, how we calibrate it in the video, the bod pod is also calibrated against a known volume. And in this case, it's a 50-liter calibration cylinder. At least 2 measurements are going to be taken, and they need to result in 150 ml volume within the 2 measurements. And it just requires a subject to sit still for 20 seconds. So when working with a population that is uncomfortable underwater, or for example, may be too buoyant to be weighed underwater, the bod pod would be a good alternative. So the 2-compartment model may underestimate body fat by about 1.8 to 2.8% when compared to a 4-compartment model. It is as accurate and valid as underwater weighing, but the underwater weighing is still considered the gold standard. And the bod pod has good reliability and low technical error because we don't ask the subject to expel all of the air, and it's just the subject sitting in the bod pod. So this is the end of this section, and I will upload another video for the other body composition methods. This is the body composition section, chapter 15. Before we get into the material, I want to show you obesity maps put out by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. This data is based upon the BRFSS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, and it's showing you the states and the rate of obesity. So in the states with the dark blue, they have 10 to 14% of the population is obese. And in the lighter blue, less than 10% of the population is obese. So this is data from 1985, and I'm just going to scroll through. And this is 1986, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, a new category was added where 15 to 19% of the population is obese. 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98. Notice a new category was added with greater than 20% of the population was obese. 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, we've added a new category here. Greater than 25% of the population is obese. 2004, 2005, a new category was added where greater than 30% of the population was obese. 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010. So this is the last map that the CDC has put out. However, they have other maps available for different ethnic or different races. And this is data from 2016 to 2018 showing the obesity rates of non-Hispanic white adults. And notice here there is a new category where greater than 35% of the population is obese. So you can see why the topic of body composition is very important and relevant today. So this is the end of this video, and I will start the PowerPoint slides in a new video. In this section, we're going to cover field-based methods for measuring body composition, primarily skin fold measurements and BIA, or bioelectric impedance analysis. For the skin fold technique, you'll need a caliper, and the general idea is to use the specific sites that are outlined in the ACSM guidelines book and pinch the skin so that you're able to lift the subcutaneous tissue and fold the skin upon itself and lift it away from the underlying tissue, and then use the caliper to measure the thickness of the skin. This is done in a rotational order. For triceps, for the 3-site model, it's triceps, suprailiac, and thigh. And for the chest, for the males, their sites that we would measure for this 3-site equation would be chest, abdomen, and thigh. All of the measurements are typically done on the right-hand side of the body, unless there is something, unless the subject's right-hand side of the body does not accurately reflect their entire body. For example, if they were immobilized due to an injury, and so their leg was in a cast or their arm was in a cast. In this case, taking the measurements on the right side of the body would not be a true representation of their body composition. So in this case, it would be appropriate to take measurements on the left-hand side of the body. Like all of the methods that we've gone through, there are assumptions of the skin fold method. One of the major assumptions is that the distribution of fat subcutaneously and viscerally is going to be the same for all individuals. We know that this is not true because older individuals have less subcutaneous fat than younger individuals. Also, we know that Japanese Asians have a higher percentage of visceral fat compared to subcutaneous fat. So when you look at somebody from Asia, they may appear to be lean, but once you do underwater weighing or the BOD-POD, where body density is taken into account, you will see that the proportion of visceral fat is higher than the proportion of subcutaneous fat. So their body fat percentage might be a little bit higher than what you would have hypothesized just by looking at them. Also, another assumption is that there's a relationship between subcutaneous fat and total body fat, and therefore the sum of several different skin fold measures can be used to estimate total fat. And then the relationship between the sum of skin folds and body density is linear. So skin fold measurements have technical sources of error where the person doing the measurement will introduce variability in the measurement. Typically, the abdomen and thigh have the highest percentage of variability. Also, you want to make sure that the participant did not exercise immediately prior, because remember the intracellular, remember the fluid shift into the interstitial space, making that area edemic, so it would overestimate the skin fold and thereby overestimating the person's body fat. There are different types of calipers out there, one being the Harpenden. The Harpenden is the most accurate skin fold caliper that is made. It costs about $400. The Harpenden produces smaller values than the Lange caliper, and the equations in the ACSM book correspond with the Lange caliper. So if you were in lab, you would be able to try both the Harpenden and the Lange, and you will notice that the Harpenden, or this caliper, exerts more pressure upon the jaws when it's let go, when this handle is let go. This is the Lange caliper, and It costs about $175. The reason why the Harpenden or Lange caliper are used in research is because regardless of how open this jaw is, it's going to exert the same amount of pressure regardless of the jaw openness. So to measure skin folds, you would use either the Harpenden or Lange caliper and measure the skin fold thickness using the different sites. So in lab, we would typically use a 3-site formula. So in males, it would be chest, abdomen, and thigh. In women, it'd be triceps, suprailiac, and thigh. If we were going to use a 7-site formula, notice that the sites are exactly the same for men, or for males and females. When using these different sites in research, I found that the 3-site formula does not or the 7-site formula does not provide more accurate results. So this is why in lab we ask you to do the 3-site formula, because it's just as accurate as the 7-site formula. I also wanted to point out that when you take the sum of the 7 skin folds or the 3 skin folds, this is the sum of each skin fold that you have taken. And so for this body density, this equation continues onto the next line. So this is one very, very long equation, and this is the subject's age. And notice that this is the sum of 3 skin folds squared. So when you're doing these equations for lab, make sure that you either use a graphing calculator or use Excel for the calculations. Once you get the body density, then you would plug it into the appropriate equation to get percentage of body fat. And this table is taken from the ACSM guidelines for exercise and exercise prescription book. So you'll notice that the white or Caucasian, age 20 to 80, this was the Siri equation which was presented in class. And then once you get the percentage of body fat, you would compare it against the normative tables. And for college age students, ages 20 to 29, you would use this column. And you'll notice that as we age, our normative tables become more lenient. So be sure when you're doing this in lab that you use the right column according to the person's age and sex, so male and female. The next method that we're going to talk about is bioelectrical impedance. Impedance, abbreviated by the capital Z, is the opposition to flow of current. Basically, what BIA is, or bioelectrical impedance, is that this machine is going to send an undetectable electrical current through your body. And the faster the current travels from one side to the other side of the body, the more water you have. The greater water component you have, this equates to greater skeletal muscle mass. So basically, this is the premise of BIA. The assumption of the BIA model assumes that our body is a perfect cylinder. So we're assuming that this person is a cylinder and the movement of the electricity from maybe foot to hand is moving across a cylinder-shaped body. This is the traditional BIA method where you'll have the subject lay supine for 5 to 10 minutes prior to taking the measurement. You want them to lay supine so that their fluid shifts reach a point of homeostasis, because as we lay down, now our heart and body are not working against gravity, and then the water will then be redistributed up into the upper torso, and blood will no longer be pulled down into the legs or the feet. Then you would attach electrodes to the individual, and then this machine would send an undetectable electrical current that you cannot feel through the body and give you the percent body fat based upon the speed of that current. This BIA model has been commercialized, and you've seen these as the Tanita scale at the store and the handheld Omron. The Tanita scale is the one that you stand on these metal plates, and it sends an undetectable electrical current up the foot, through the foot of one leg and down the other leg. So it basically takes or estimates a percentage of body fat in your lower half of the body. On the other hand, the Omron, the handheld device, which sends an electrical current from one hand to the other, takes a percentage or estimates the percentage of body fat in your upper body. I found that the Omron is a pretty accurate method of measuring percentage of body fat, and it's relatively inexpensive. I believe you can find it online for $50. So this is a really good option if you want to measure percentage of body fat in the field, is using this Omron. There's something else called the segmental BIA model. And remember I said that this BIA assumes that we're one cylinder. The segmental BIA model breaks up the body into 5 segments, where each segment represents the limb, the leg, or the trunk. So there's 5 segments that the body is broken up into. And this is important when we want to measure any fluid shifts from limb to limb. So say a patient has abnormal fluid distribution and we want to monitor their lymphedema symptoms over time. This is an example of when this segmental BIA model would be appropriate. So in this model, the subject will stand on 2 metal foot electrodes and then hold on to 2 handles. And this model will send 2 types of frequency, a low frequency and a higher frequency. The low frequency will pass through the extracellular water or the extracellular space through the extracellular water, and the higher frequency will pass actually through the cells. So through both the intracellular water, the water contained within the cells, and the water surrounding the cells, or the extracellular water. So this model is really good for special populations, for patients with cachexia who have abnormal amounts of percentage of body fat because they're unable to keep on body weight and they are having a hard time keeping on skeletal muscle mass and so forth. So we use this BIA method, the segmental BIA method, in the clinic, and I've found so far, based upon comparing this method to the handheld Omron, that the measurements are pretty close. I would say plus and minus 2% body fat, which is pretty darn close because this piece of equipment costs $50. And depending on which model you get for this in-body, it can cost upwards of $20,000. So the handheld Omron I found has been a trusty source and a trusty way of measuring percentage of body fat. Of course, we're relying on the speed of the electrical activity based upon water component. So this means there are assumptions that we need to take into account. For example, we're going to assume that your subject is hydrated. We're going to assume that the person did not previously just exercise, which would cause fluid shifts into the interstitial space, which would make their body fat look lower than it really is. We're going to assume that they're fully hydrated and they are not dehydrated. For example, they didn't drink a lot of caffeine or another diuretic such as alcohol. Since this method measures the speed at which this undetectable electrical current moves through our body, it doesn't take into account the movement of the electrical current through our digestive tract, our GI tract. So this means that if you eat or ingest something immediately prior to doing this method, it will have a minimal effect. However, if you've eaten or drank a lot 2 to 4 hours prior to doing this method, it would affect the resistance and impedance because whatever you've ingested would have been absorbed from your GI tract. So this is what this bullet point is saying, is that eating or drinking immediately prior to the test, so within the first hour, would have minimal effect, versus measurements taken 2 to 4 hours after a meal would decrease the resistance and impedance. So of course, other things like sitting in a sauna or a jacuzzi that would cause fluid shifts and dehydration, these things would also alter the results of BIA. So guidelines include making sure that the subject has not previously exercised, because if you exercise, it will increase the blood flow and warm the skeletal muscle, which will decrease the impedance and underestimate the percentage of body fat. You want to make sure that the person is hydrated normally and did not arrive for the test dehydrated as well. Body position will also be affected. So the bottom line is you want to take the measurement under the same conditions pre and post exercise. So for the traditional BIA, when the subject is supine, you want them to lay supine for about 10 minutes prior to the test to allow those fluid shifts to normalize. If you're using the handheld Omron or the Tanita, where these tests are going to be done in the upright position, you want to make sure that this person has been standing in this upright position for at least 10 minutes. Again, so you just want to make sure that the conditions are normalized and the same for both the tests. And this concludes this section. So in this section, we're going to talk about the different illnesses that can happen when we move to altitude. Acute mountain sickness is one of the most common illnesses that appears after exposure to altitude. The onset is 6 to 48 hours after arrival, with the most severe symptoms occurring 2 to 3 days after exposure starts. The symptoms include headache, nausea and vomiting, dyspnea, and insomnia. In a different section, we talked about dyspnea. In layman's terms, we describe this as inability to catch your breath. But physiologically, we know dyspnea results because there's a mismatch between the body's ability to regulate the partial pressures of O2 and CO2 against ventilation. So that dysregulation results in dyspnea. These symptoms can develop into more lethal conditions, and the frequency of AMS is more frequent with women versus men. So the incidence of AMS is higher in females versus males. The frequency of AMS increases with increasing altitude. So with an increase in altitude or the rate of ascent, the susceptibility of AMS increases. So the use of base camps to ascend slowly would reduce the risk of AMS. Possible causes of AMS include a low ventilatory response to altitude. We mentioned in the previous section that one of the first immediate responses to altitude is hyperventilation. So if a person has low ventilatory response, the CO2 will accumulate and result in acidosis, and this is one cause of AMS. Headache is the most common symptom experienced at altitude. So if you ever visited the top of Mauna Kea, which is 4,200 meters above sea level, you may have experienced headache, just a consistent throbbing in your head. And it's often worse in the morning and after exercise. And the pain that you feel in your head is due to the hypoxic conditions that you're in. So the hypoxic conditions stimulates the vasodilation of your vessels in your cerebrum, and this stimulates the stretch pain receptors, which you perceive as throbbing or pain. Another illness is the Cheyne-Stokes breathing, and this is basically an interruption of sleeping during ventilation due to hypoxia. So it's characterized by rapid breathing and then slow, shallow breathing with intermittent periods when breathing completely stops. So this is similar to sleep apnea. And the reason for this is because as we hyperventilate, we start to blow off too much CO2. And as a result, we become alkaline. And so this alkalinity is going to be detected by the chemoreceptors, and it's going to stimulate the brain respiratory control center to reduce the breathing rate so that CO2 can now build back up to normal levels. While ventilation is suppressed, O2 content decreases. And so it's a cycle of balancing O2 and CO2 partial pressures, which is causing the alternation of increased rapid breathing, slow shallow breathing, and then periods where breathing completely stops. So this is one of the causes of insomnia, as we saw with acute mountain sickness, and it does not allow for very restful sleep, as you can imagine, at altitude. So acute mountain sickness, it develops 6 to 12 hours after ascent. It peaks 2 to 3 days after exposure, and it usually resolves itself within a week with acclimatization. So if the symptoms are not reversed with supplemental oxygen, descent obviously would be the proper treatment. AMS is also associated with fluid retention, which leads to increased intracranial pressure and lung swelling, which is going to impair the O2 and CO2 exchange. So although we talked about how at altitude, the low oxygen content in the blood is a result of the low barometric pressure, this is an instance where there's going to be other factors that are going to limit oxygen diffusion across the respiratory membrane. And in this case, it's edema of the lung. So the fluid retention is caused by the renal handling of the water, where it switches from a net loss to no change to a net water gain. And then the fluid will be moved into the intracellular space. So to prevent AMS, it's suggested that a gradual ascent to altitude is used, to have a supplemental oxygen available in hyperbaric rescue bags. And obviously, retreat to a lower altitude would be the most common and easiest treatment. The length of stay and the altitude reach, and also the speed at which the person ascends, is going to directly affect the presence of AMS and the severity of its symptoms. A diet rich in carbohydrates may reduce AMS symptoms by 30%. Mild exercise aids acclimatization. So if you are experiencing AMS, doing some sort of mild, low to moderate exercise, whether it be walking, this process aids acclimatization. Sleeping low and climbing high is another alternative, where you would climb high during the day and then come back down to a base camp to sleep at night. And this will help to reduce AMS symptoms. The age, gender, health status, and previous experience at altitude, and of course, genetic inheritance is going to play a factor in whether you display symptoms of AMS. So if you're going to ascend to altitude, you may want to have Diamox on hand. So acetazolamine is something that inhibits carbonic anhydrase. So carbonic anhydrase is an enzyme which catalyzes this reaction. So if we do not allow this reaction to move forward, then the production of CO2 is reduced, which reduces the amount of CO2 that's going to be blown off. So this Diamox will help to reduce pH levels by helping to retain the hydrogen ions within the body. Again, at altitude, the kidneys excrete bicarbonate. So the renal excretion of bicarbonate also helps to help retain CO2 within the body and helps to maintain pH levels. At altitude, there are two life-threatening conditions, one being high-altitude pulmonary edema and the other being high-altitude cerebral edema. And they can develop from severe altitude sickness. So these usually happen on a continuum. And the presence of HAPE or HACE means that treatment or retreat to a lower altitude should happen immediately. So high altitude pulmonary edema is likely related to pulmonary vasoconstriction due to hypoxia, as the body is trying to adapt to hypoxic conditions. It can also involve clot formation in the pulmonary circulation. And the symptoms are shortness of breath, coughing, tightness in the chest, fatigue. On the outside, the person's lips would be bluish in color, the fingernails would be bluish in color. The person will have confusion and they also may be unconscious. So obviously, supplemental oxygen and immediate descent to lower altitude would be the appropriate measure to take. High altitude cerebral edema is a little bit more serious than the pulmonary edema. And this is due to the edemic pressure buildup in the intracranial space. So in both HAPE and HACE, confusion is a symptom. In both scenarios, confusion is a symptom. It also results in lethargy, so feeling fatigued, ataxia, unconsciousness, and even death. So in this case, supplemental oxygen and immediate descent to lower altitude would be appropriate. So this image is showing you high altitude cerebral edema, where the blood vessels are able to leak fluid into the intracranial space, increasing the amount of pressure around the brain, and this can lead to confusion, coma, and even death. So the difference between lowlanders and high altitude natives. So high altitude natives are those who live and reside at altitude. So between lowlanders and high altitude natives, they have the same exercise economy and similar body composition. What sets high altitude natives apart is that they are polycythemic, which means their hematocrit is greater than 60%, which means their oxygen carrying capacity is higher than lowlanders. The high altitude natives have larger heart dimensions, greater cardiac mass, larger lungs, more capillaries, and they have a larger chest in relation to their total body. So they have a larger lung capacity in relation to lowlanders. So the high altitude natives have about 65% hematocrit, and if you recall, the normal hematocrit is about 42 to 48 in females, 45 to 52% in males. So high altitude natives have significantly higher hematocrit levels. So the oxygen carrying capacity of the high altitude natives is 28% greater than sea level residents. So what's also really interesting is that the high altitude natives have more extensive coronary artery circulation, which is going to protect them from residing in hypoxic conditions. So this means that they have a greater capacity for oxygen diffusion across the lungs capillaries, and this helps to combat against the low partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, and it helps to diffuse more oxygen into the blood. And the greater the surface area, or the greater the capillarization, and the greater the surface area of contact between the pulmonary capillaries and the alveoli, this increases the amount of oxygen that can be diffused across that membrane, and that is in accordance with Fick's law of diffusion. So high altitude natives also have lower incidences of coronary artery disease, and during childhood, the maximum benefits of acclimatization due to the oxygen transport mechanisms during puberty and other critical periods of growth and development, so that during that childhood time, this is when the high altitude natives have the maximum benefits, or they achieve, or they receive the maximum benefits. So when lowlanders become residents at 4,000 meters, which is altitude, their cardiac output falls and remains suppressed for months. And this is a stressful event for lowlanders as they reside at altitude. So, of course, it's going to stimulate the HPA axis, which is one of our stress response axes. If you recall, the HPA axis is when the hypothalamus releases cortical releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary gland to stimulate ACTH, which then moves to act in an endocrine fashion on the adrenal cortex, which stimulates cortisol. So this increased cortisol level is seen in lowlanders as they move to high altitude, but the high altitude natives do not have increased cortisol levels, indicating that they're acclimatized to this environment and living in the environment is not perceived as a stress. So if you're a lowlander and you move to high altitude, your cortisol levels will return to pre-exposure levels after 1 week of exposure. And this is the end of this section. Welcome to nutrition. So in this section, we're going to cover nutrition as it relates to exercise performance. So similar to the other section, I am not going to go over every single slide. However, please do review the material, as the slides that I am skipping over, the material presented on those slides are pretty straightforward. So for example, I will be going over slides with this blue star in the upper left-hand corner. The main concept in this section will be carbo loading and carbohydrate utilization during exercise. So we know that carbohydrates are the main source or the body's preferred fuel for energy and energy production. Not only is it the body's preferred source, it is the only source of energy that can be used for high intensity exercise lasting greater than 60 seconds. And this is our glycolytic system. And also glucose is the only energy or the only substrate that the nervous system can rely on. So a high carbohydrate diet will allow the complete recovery of muscle glycogen levels between 2-hour work bouts. And what this graph is showing is that in subjects who ingested a high carbohydrate diet between these work bouts, they're able to maintain their muscle glycogen levels versus individuals who did not consume high carbohydrate diets. Over progressive exercises, their muscle glycogen levels started to decrease over time. So that a high carbohydrate diet would maximize carbohydrate storage within the muscle, and in the muscle, it's stored as muscle glycogen. Glycogen is used as quickly as the usage of glycogen is going to be used as a function of the intensity of the exercise. So for example, if we're working at 31% of our max, muscle glycogen will last for 180 minutes. Versus if we're working at a super maximal intensity at 120 or 150% of our max, our glycogen in our muscle will be depleted within 30 minutes. And the reason for this, if you recall, is in these lower intensity exercises, we are relying on fat metabolism. So the reliance on glucose when we're working at 31 or 64% of our max is going to be much lower. And this is going to allow us to use glycogen at a slower rate. So eccentric exercise also impairs muscle glycogen resynthesis. So after performing eccentric exercise or negatives, the amount of glucose that can be stored within that muscle is going to be reduced. And there's some evidence that suggests that this eccentrically exercised muscle is less sensitive to insulin, which would also limit its uptake of glucose. So just keep this in mind if you're trying to replenish your glycogen storage. Your glycogen storage is going to be inhibited after a really tough eccentric exercise regimen. Most athletes should consume 50% of their diet. From athletes, 50% of the diet should be comprised of carbohydrates. For endurance athletes, the contribution of carbohydrates in their diet should be a little bit higher. And in this case, I've written 55 to 65%. So depending on the intensity of the exercise will determine the energy contribution or the amount of carbohydrates that the athlete should ingest. As in the previous slide where I showed that very high intensity exercise would result in quicker carbohydrate depletion, this is showing that the higher the intensity of the exercise, the greater the intake of carbohydrates should be. So this slide is just giving you an example of what 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight would look like. So again, you would multiply 8 to 12 grams if you are an athlete who is performing at extremely high intensities, and multiply it by your body weight in kilograms. And this would give you an absolute amount of carbohydrates that you must ingest per day. And I've given examples of types of foods and the amount of carbohydrates within each food. So not only is the total amount of carbohydrate important, but what's also important is the quality of carbohydrates, or the glycemic index. Glycemic index is an arbitrarily assigned number, and it's going to be scored relative to the glucose response to 50 grams of sugar, of table sugar. So the GI index is equal to the blood glucose response over 2 hours to a test food in relation to the response of blood glucose to glucose itself. So a high GI food or high glycemic food is anything with a GI of greater than 70. And this includes sports drinks, jelly beans, baked potato, I'll bet without the skin, French fries, which are the inside part of the potato, and popcorn and cornflakes. The moderately GI rated foods are foods that have a GI of 56 to 70, and this includes bread, white rice, bananas, and ice cream. Ice cream has a lower GI than sports drinks because it has a higher fat content that would help to reduce the GI. Low GI foods are categorized as GIs less than or equal to 55, and this includes beans, milk, M&Ms, presumably with nuts or peanuts, because if you add or consume foods of a high GI nature with foods of a low GI nature, the collective response would be a reduced GI. So if you're going to consume carbohydrates right before exercise, you want to consume food with a low GI. So essentially, you don't want to have your body start to store the glucose because you've eaten a high GI food. So you're going to start exercise with low blood sugars. When you want to consume carbohydrates during exercise, these should be of high GI nature. So for example, the GIs for these different food groups are listed on this table. So for example, peanuts has a pretty low GI rated less than 55, indicating it's a low GI food. Baked potato is a high GI food listed at 85, which is greater than 70, which is the cutoff point for a high GI food. So high GI food should not be ingested 15 to 45 minutes before exercise. And the reason being that if you ingest a high GI food, glucose levels in your blood will go up. As a response, insulin would be secreted, and this insulin will start to store your glucose, and your blood glucose levels will drop. The reason why insulin is released is because you have not started exercise yet. Remember, we said that during exercise, insulin is going to be inhibited. If you were to exercise and ingest a high GI food, insulin would be inhibited, so you would not have this drop in blood glucose. So again, if you're eating prior to exercise, 15 to 45 minutes prior to exercise, the carbohydrate of choice should be a low GI source. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. I'm going to skip this slide. And I'm going to skip this slide. Okay, so the bottom line is that pre-exercise, consuming a low GI food is going to prevent the insulin response and the dropping of blood glucose. As a result, you would start your exercise with reduced blood glucose, which is not ideal. If you are exercising and you need to replenish your carbohydrates or fuel, a high GI food would be a good alternative. So this would include sports drinks, those gel packets. Anything with a high GI content will help support your carbohydrate fuel source during exercise. And then post-exercise, eating a high GI food will help to maintain blood glucose levels and help glycogen replenishment. So although we're talking about aerobic type exercise or anaerobic type exercise, where we're talking about an endurance type activity, we are also able to deplete our muscle glycogen with weight training. So in this one study, they showed that a single set of bicep curls or elbow flexion at 80% of 1 RM up until muscular failure caused a 12% reduction in glycogen concentration. So note that they went to muscular failure, indicating that volitional fatigue was reached, indicating that the lack of fuel may have been the cause of fatigue. Other studies also reported similar findings where muscular contractions of the vastus lateralis led to a 38% decrease in glycogen. So therefore, although you may not be performing an endurance-like activity, if you are performing a weight training regimen where you take your muscles to volitional fatigue, your glycogen supply or storage within that muscle will be depleted, and therefore glycogen resynthesis and restorage would be necessary. So if you know that you are going to participate in some event such as a marathon or an event where repeated muscular contractions until fatigue is going to occur, you might benefit from glycogen loading, and this is also called carbohydrate loading. And the idea behind carbohydrate loading is that you ingest a lot of carbohydrates, so you pack your liver and your muscle with the maximum amount of glycogen that it can store, and that way you'll have the substrates ready for use during exercise. The general rule of thumb is that if the activity is going to last greater than 60 seconds, you may benefit from glycogen or carbo loading. So the classic carbo loading protocol is A-strands glycogen loading, where it requires depletion of glycogen in the first stage. So over the first few days, well, on the first day, you're going to perform exhaustive exercise to deplete your muscle glycogen in the particular muscle you're looking to maximize. So if you're going to be in a rowing competition, it makes sense to deplete your carbohydrates in the upper body instead of going out for a run. If you're going to be running a marathon, it makes sense for you to deplete your muscle glycogen by using your legs for a run until volitional fatigue. Then on days 2 to 4, you will ingest a low carbohydrate diet. And then in stage 2 and days 5, 6, and 7, you will slowly increase the amount of carbohydrates in your diet. And at the same time, you're going to taper off your exercise, because it doesn't make sense for you to replenish your carbohydrates and then carry out your same exercise intensity and deplete the carbohydrates that you've just repleted your muscle with. So there is a tapering effect, which may lead to a detraining effect in carbo loading. Then at stage 3 is competition day, and you'd follow or you'd start that day with a high carbohydrate pre-competition meal right before you compete. Sherman's glycogen loading is a little bit different from A-strands, and it states that you do not have to deplete your glycogen through all-out exercise. What Sherman's model says is that you could slowly increase the amount of glycogen or the amount of carbohydrates you ingest and taper off your exercise regimen. And then by day 5 or 6, you would have the same amount of carbohydrates stored as muscle glycogen in your body. So in red, it's showing A-strands model where you're going to do exhaustive exercise. So your muscle glycogen is going to be reduced. And then you're going to slowly increase your amount of carbohydrate intake through your diet and taper off your exercise regimen. Sherman's glycogen loading protocol says that you do not have to do that exhaustive exercise, but you can just start to increase carbohydrates in your diet and taper off your exercise, and the results would be about the same. So the benefits of carbo loading or glycogen loading is that you'd be able to increase your muscle glycogen by 2 to 3 times, so 200 to 300%. It will increase your endurance capacity and increase your sprinting ability at the end of a prolonged activity. This glycogen loading protocol is not going to be effective or recommended for individuals who have type 2 diabetes, because eating a diet high in carbohydrates goes against the recommendations for type 2 diabetics. Also, if you've ever carbo loaded, you've noticed that your muscles feel stiff and heavy. And this is because with every gram of glycogen, 2.6 grams of water are stored along with it. So it's a heavy feel, and it'll make you feel not very agile and just kind of bloated and stiff. Also, your glycogen loading has a detraining effect because you can't, or you wouldn't want to use all the glycogen that you've already replenished your muscles with. So you're going to take it easy right before competition. This graph is just showing subjects with high carbohydrate diet are able to exercise longer than those on low or normal carbohydrate diets. This graph is showing that muscle glycogen synthesis is slow, and it's going to require several days to restore normal blood glucose. Not normal blood glucose. It's going to require several days to restore normal muscle glycogen following exhaustive exercise. So you can see that glycogen during the event has decreased, and then as a result, glycogen synthase, an enzyme which helps to increase glycogen synthesis, is going to increase, but it takes a little bit of time over the period of the next few days to maximize glycogen storage again. So therefore, it goes to stand that scheduling back-to-back long endurance events is not going to be a good idea from the substrate point of view, where you wouldn't be able to maximize your glycogen storage after a very exhaustive endurance-like race. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this slide. This slide is just showing how to achieve positive protein balance, where on this side it's showing a negative protein balance, and on this side it's showing a positive protein balance. And this is being accomplished with exercise and feeding. So if you recall, there was a slide in a previous chapter which talked about how insulin, exercise, and specifically leucine stimulates the mTOR pathway to stimulate protein synthesis. So there was a study that involved subjects who cycled. And these subjects would cycle unilaterally, so with only one leg, and the other leg would rest. And they did muscle biopsies to look at the amount of protein synthesis that occurred in the muscle. And these subjects ingested either whey, casein, or soy-based protein. And what the study showed was that protein synthesis was maximized in subjects who ingested whey in the exercising muscle. And this is where this graph comes from, where our positive protein balance is going to be maximized when we feed with whey-based protein and combine it with exercise. And the mechanism behind this is because exercise and amino acids, specifically leucine and also insulin, are stimulators of protein synthesis or muscle growth. The next two slides talks about carbohydrate replenishment through sports drinks. So if you've noticed, if you drink Powerade or Gatorade, the carbohydrate component should not be higher than 6%, because if it's higher than 6%, it slows down the gastric emptying and it can cause GI distress and give you an upset stomach. So what this graph is showing is that with higher carbohydrate content, there's a lower rate of gastric emptying. So if you're going to replenish with a sports drink during a long endurance event, pick a drink or pick a replenishment fluid with a 6% or less contribution from carbohydrates. So if you've ever tried the difference between Powerade and Gatorade, Gatorade uses glucose as the carbohydrate. Powerade uses fructose as its carbohydrate. Typically, for most individuals, glucose is going to be kinder to the stomach and not cause so much GI distress, which is probably why most athletes or most people prefer Gatorade over Powerade. When you're designing or when you're going to plan for a long endurance event, you want to make sure that the fluid that you're drinking is supplied in a bottle with a wide mouth. It's cool and palatable. You don't want to be using a bottle where you need to suck to get that fluid out, because it's going to make it harder for you to hydrate and get the carbohydrate replenishment that you need. So this is the end of this section, and I will come back and record a new section for the second and third parts of this video. In this section, we'll be looking at fat and protein consumption and its relation to exercise performance. Again, I'm going to go over slides with the star in the upper left-hand corner. Again, do not skip over slides that I do not spend a lot of time on, as they still contain important information, but the information is very straightforward. So I'm going to skip this slide and this slide. And we're going to head right into proteins here. So what's important about this slide is the RDAs, or the recommended dietary allowances, for these different demographics. What you will be responsible for knowing is the RDAs of children 4 to 13 years of age, children 14 to 18 years of age, and adults. And then later in this section, I'll show you the RDAs for the different types of athletes. You will be responsible for knowing those numbers as well. So I would like to point out that children 4 to 13 years of age have a higher RDA than children 14 to 18, because it makes sense. Children 4 to 13 are exhibiting the greatest trajectory of growth. And it's interesting to note that the children's RDA for protein consumption is higher than the average adult who is not exercising. And then I give an example of how to calculate this. Okay, so this is the other slide that's important, where strength athletes are recommended to consume 1.6 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, and endurance athletes 1.2 to 1.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. There is no evidence that shows that exceeding 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is beneficial, and in fact, it will or may have a detrimental effect to the kidney, which needs to secrete unused amino acids. And this can also contribute to dehydration. So the bottom line is that 10 to 15% of calories should come from protein. So these next slides, we're going to talk about vitamins. Please make sure to go through these slides, and I'm going to focus on the vitamins that have an impact on performance. So the B complex vitamins come from fish, meat sources. So if you're working with athletes who are vegan, they will need to supplement and get their B complex vitamins in a different manner. So vitamin B1 is thiamine, and this is needed for the conversion of pyruvic acid to acetyl-CoA, which is the first step in the Krebs cycle. Vitamin B2 is riboflavin, and this becomes FAD, which acts as a hydrogen acceptor during oxidation in the electron transport system, which is our aerobic system, which helps us to generate ATP. Vitamin B3 is niacin, and it's a component of NAD, the very, very important coenzyme in glycolysis. And vitamin B12 is needed for red blood cell production. So you can see if an athlete or a client is deficient in your B complex vitamins, this would result in fatigue, inability to produce energy or ATP, or inability to carry oxygen to the muscles on red blood cells. So athletes or clients who are vegan may use something called nutritional yeast. And if you have never tried nutritional yeast, I would encourage you to try it. And if you like tofu, I would encourage you to try and make tofu scramble with nutritional yeast. That was the first thing that I've tried to make, and I actually thought it was very, very delicious. So I leave that up to you to try nutritional yeast. Nutritional yeast is fairly tasty as well. So you can add it to your stir-fry dishes or whatever it may be. We're going to skip the vitamin C, and we're going to skip these next slides. And we're going to talk about iron. Iron is a micromineral, and it's required for the formation of hemoglobin and myoglobin. So it's very important in our oxygen carrying capacity. So if you have an athlete who is anemic, who has a low iron content, they're gonna feel fatigued because their body is not going to be able to carry, or their blood cells, they won't have enough blood cells to carry oxygen to their skeletal muscles, and this would inhibit their performance. And this brings us to the end of this section. Again, please go back and review the slides that I did not spend a lot of time on. They are still important. It's just that the information on those slides were very straightforward. In this next section, we're going to examine water and hydration. Water is very important because it makes up our blood plasma, our blood volume, which transports and delivers nutrients to our tissues. So if we were to take all our total body water, we would be able to divide it into two compartments, one being our intracellular space, or the water contained within our cells, and 1/3 of the water would be contained in our extracellular space. This extracellular space is comprised of our blood within our vascular space, and then also fluid surrounding our cells, so our interstitial space. The intracellular space contains most of our total body water, with only 1/3 of our total body water being contained in our vasculature within our interstitial space. And this also includes our lymph. So we lose water, and the water that we lose through our respiration and skin that we do not sense is called insensible water loss. And then 60% of water is filtered out through our kidneys and we excrete it. 5% of our water loss is through sweating, and then 5% is through fecal loss through our large intestine. Our intake of water primarily comes from what we ingest. So 60% of water comes from the fluids we drink, and then 30% of water comes from the foods we eat, such as fruits or vegetables that contain a high content of water. And then 10% of the water is produced in our cells during metabolism. So at rest, most of the water that we intake, again, is through fluids. 30% of the water we intake is through foods. 10% of the water we have is going to be through metabolic production. At rest, we lose more water through our respiration and through our insensible water loss. During exercise, most of our water loss happens through sweating, and only 10% of our water loss comes from insensible water loss. So we're going to skip this slide because it just reiterates what we talked about in the previous slide. Now we're going to skip this slide because now we're going to talk about dehydration. So a body weight loss of 2% due to dehydration is enough to impair performance. So what this slide is showing is that somebody who's hydrated in blue versus a subject who is dehydrated in red. The hydrated subject is going to be able to maintain a higher running velocity compared to the dehydrated subject. How does dehydration affect performance? Well, one, if you're dehydrated, your plasma volume is reduced, so your heart rate would have to increase. Frank Starling's mechanism says this does not allow for greater filling, and so your cardiac output or stroke volume is going to be reduced. So you're going to have less cardiac output to support you during exercise. Also, if these subjects were running in a hot environment, the blood would be redirected to the skin in an effort to dissipate the heat. So now we have more competition of blood between the working muscles and the skin. So the hydrated individual would be better equipped to handle the redirection of blood to the skin and working muscles versus the dehydrated subject. So this slide is showing the effect of dehydration on heart rate. And this is directly related to plasma volume. So if we do not hydrate during exercise, our plasma volume drops, which will result in a reduced venous return. And as a result, heart rate would have to increase to compensate for the reduced stroke volume. So this is what this graph is showing, that replenishment with either water or IV saline will help to keep heart rate at a steady state level. But notice in both scenarios, cardiovascular drift has occurred where although the workload remained the same, in both the red and green scenarios with either water or saline, heart rate slowly drifted up over time, showing that there was additional dehydration and water loss. So what are the effects of dehydration? Obviously, we'll have a reduction of blood or plasma volume. This reduction in plasma volume would reduce venous return, and as a result, cardiac output and stroke volume would be reduced. To compensate for the reduction in stroke volume, heart rate would need to be increased. The onset of blood lactate or the ventilatory threshold or the anaerobic point would be reduced because with a reduction in plasma volume, now we have a reduction of oxygen delivery. So now we're going to shift our reliance more on the anaerobic metabolism because we're not supplying the aerobic metabolism with enough oxygen. So our ventilatory threshold would drop, which means the intensity at which we could perform exercise would be reduced. Muscle strength and muscle endurance may or may not change. Research has shown both scenarios where with dehydration, muscular strength was reduced, and then other studies showed that there was no change in muscular strength or endurance. On the other hand, run time to exhaustion and total work performed in an endurance event are reduced when the subject is dehydrated. So as far as sweat composition, we are going to be mostly concerned with our sodium and potassium loss. So we're going to skip through these slides here. And we talked about this before, where we know that by the time we're thirsty, we're already dehydrated. And the reason for this is because our osmoreceptors are detecting the osmolality of our plasma, and it's sending this signal to the hypothalamus. As a result, the hypothalamus is signaling, is giving signals of thirst. So the human thirst mechanism is a poor gauge, and it does not sense thirst until we're already dehydrated, until our plasma osmolality is already high. So again, plasma osmolality, when that's increased, it will stimulate thirst. A water loss of greater than 2 liters is going to stimulate thirst. Our renin-angiotensin system makes us feel thirsty, and our mouth and throat receptors are going to stimulate thirst as well. And stomach distension. So if we are drinking a lot of water, or perhaps we just ate a big meal, we might have that thirst sensation, but the fullness that we feel in our stomach may inhibit us from hydrating. So that stomach distension is going to also be a mechanism which regulates thirst, where the stretch of our stomach is going to be sensed, and this will give our CNS feedback and inhibit us from drinking. Hyponatremia is defined as low sodium content in the blood. So hypo meaning low, natremia referring to sodium. So hyponatremia can result when an athlete is performing endurance events in the heat and they're only replenishing with water and not replenishing with sodium and water. So as a result, they're losing fluid, but they're only replenishing with water that is going to reduce their plasma osmolality. And so that's what is being reflected on this side of the graph, is that when the concentration of sodium in our plasma becomes too reduced, it will result in changes in our physical function, and in severe cases, it could lead to coma. Hyponatremia is rare. It takes a lot of willpower and motivation on the athlete or subject's part to reach a state of hyponatremia. And usually we hear these cases of hyponatremia in competitions of who can drink the most water. And the last I heard was a radio station that promoted this water drinking competition, resulting in hyponatremia and death of the contestant. And this is the end of our water section.